Every one of us has a book we find holy. We all have a text that reaches into us upon the first reading and divulges truths that echo beyond kalpas, eras, and human understanding. I believe this understanding requires a commitment to uncovering the stories we tell ourselves, what value they have, and how they define us as human beings. For me, my holy text is the Bhagavad Gita, and my favorite translation is by a name synonymous in the West with this sacred text, Eknath Easwaran. The Indian born inventor of a silent meditative tradition known as passage meditation, where practitioners memorize texts and silently reflect upon them while meditating. Eswaran's translation of the Gita is heralded for its completeness while maintaining its concise nature within a rendering that is engrossing as it is introspective. I do not intend to proselytize, only introduce. Even within Hinduism and other practices, there is a respect for the atheists that does not disallow them from enjoying and finding enrichment in spirituality. I will read from the beginning of the Gita, and if moved, I hope you will check out the book in the link below. Let us read. Chapter 1. The War Within. Dhritarashtra. O Sanjaya, tell me what happened at Kurukshetra, the field of Dharma, where my family and the Pandavas gathered to fight. Sanjaya. Having surveyed the forces of the Pandavas arrayed for battle, Prince Duryodhana approached his teacher Drona and spoke, O my teacher, look at this mighty army of the Pandavas, assembled by your own gifted disciple, Yudhishthira. There are heroic warriors and great archers who are the equals of Bhima and Arjuna, Yuyutana, Virata, the mighty Drupada, Dhritarashtakatu, Chaitanya, the valiant king of Kashi, Purujit, Kuntibhoja, the great leader Sabaya, the powerful Udamanu, the valiant Utamujas, and the son of Subhadra, in addition to the sons of Drupadi. All these command mighty chariots. O best of Brahmins, listen to the names of those who are distinguished among our own forces. Bhishma, Karna, and the victorious Kripa, Ashvatthama, Vikarna, and the sons of Somadetta. There are many others too, heroes giving up their lives for my sake, all proficient in war and armed with a variety of weapons. Our army is unlimited and commanded by Bhishma. Theirs is small and commanded by Bhima. Let everyone take his proper place and stand firm supporting Bhishma. Then the powerful Bhishma, the grandsire, oldest of all the Kurus, in order to cheer Duryodhana, roared like a lion and blew his conch horn. After Bhishma, a tremendous noise arose of conchs and cow horns and pounding on drums. Then Sri Krishna and Arjuna, who were standing in a mighty chariot yoked with white horses, blew on their divine conchs. Sri Krishna blew on the conch named Panchajanya, and Arjuna blew that conch Devadatta. The mighty Bhima blew the huge conch Pandra. Yudhishthira, the king, the son of Kunti, blew the conch Anatavijaya. Nakula and Sahadeva blew their own conchs as well. Then the king of Kashi, the leading bowman, the great warrior Shikandi, Drishta Virata, the invincible Satyaki, Drupada, all the sons of Drupadi, and the strong-armed men of Subhadra joined in, and the noise tore through the heart of Duryodhana's army. Indeed, the sound was tumultuous, echoing throughout heaven and earth. Then, O Dhritarashtra, lord of the earth, having seen your son's forces set in their places and the fighting about to begin, Arjuna spoke these words to Sri Krishna. Arjuna, O Krishna, drive my chariot between the two armies. I want to see those who desire to fight me. With whom will this battle be fought? I want to see those assembled to fight for Duryodhana, those who seek to please the evil-minded son of Dhritarashtra by engaging in war. Sanjaya. Thus Arjuna spoke, and Sri Krishna, driving his splendid chariot between the two armies, facing Bhishma and Drona and all the kings of the earth, said, Arjuna, behold all the Kurus gathered together. And Arjuna, standing between the two armies, saw fathers and grandfathers, teachers, uncles and brothers, sons and grandsons, in-laws and friends. Seeing his kinsmen established in opposition, Arjuna was overcome by sorrow. Despairing, he spoke these words. Arjuna. O Krishna, I see my own relations here anxious to fight, and my limbs grow weak. My mouth is dry, my body shakes, and my hair is standing on end. My skin burns, and the bow Gandhava has slipped from my hand. I am unable to stand. My mind seems to be whirling. These signs bode evil for us. I do not see any good that can come from killing our relations in battle. O Krishna, I have no desire for victory, or for a kingdom or pleasures. Of what use is a kingdom, or pleasures, or even life, if those whose sake we desire these things, teachers, fathers, sons, grandfathers, uncles, in-laws, grandsons, and others with family ties, are engaging in this battle, renouncing their wealth and their lives? Even if they were to kill me, I would not want to kill them, not even to become ruler of the three worlds. How much less for the earth alone? O Krishna, what satisfaction could we find in killing Dhritarashtra's sons? We would become sinners by slaying these men, even though they are evil. The sons of Dhritarashtra are related to us, therefore we should not kill them. How can we gain happiness by killing members of our own family? Though they are overpowered by greed and see no evil in destroying families and injuring friends, we see these evils. Why shouldn't we turn away from this sin? When a family declines, ancient traditions are destroyed. With them are lost the spiritual foundations for life, and the family loses its sense of unity. Where there is no sense of unity, the women of the family become corrupt, and with the corruption of its women, society is plunged into chaos. Social chaos is hell for the family and for those who have destroyed the family as well. It disrupts the process of spiritual evolution begun by our ancestors. The timeless spiritual foundations of family and society would be destroyed by these terrible deeds, which violate the unity of life. It is said that those whose family dharma has been destroyed dwell in hell. This is a great sin. We are prepared to kill our own relations out of greed for the pleasures of a kingdom. Better for me if the sons of Dhritarashtra, weapon in hand, were to attack me in battle and kill me unarmed and unresisting. Sanjaya. Overwhelmed by sorrow, Arjuna spoke these words, and casting away his bow and arrows, he sat down in his chariot in the middle of the battlefield. This next book is one of my absolute favorite fantasy novels, and a standalone that deserves to be mentioned again and again. This is K.V. Johansen's BLACKDOG, published by Pyre in 2011. Full of deep, wonderful world-building in the lands of Marakand that span seas of grass and tundra, and filled with some of the most three-dimensional characters that ever graced the annals of epic fantasy. This book is a backpack adventure full of fun, intrigue, and some genuine reality that is often lacking in Western fantasy canons. Following a raid on a lakeside village by a powerful sorcerer, the mercenary Halasayan is forced to take on the demonic aspect of the BLACKDOG, a mysterious being, to protect the goddess Atalissa, an avatar destined to defeat the evil forces arrayed against her. Taking to the wide roads of Marakand, this lovingly wrought world is full of profound beauty and complexity backed by great characters. I love this book. Halasayan is one of the most accessible male characters I've had the pleasure of reading, and the author gives a real perspective to Atalissa and her cohorts as they navigate the caravan-laden world of a setting I constantly think about still. There's a real love in this book for its world, and great world building is always based on the love of its nature, its spirit, and its people. This book does so much, and its impact, for me, is profound. I liken this to Earthsea. If you're looking for a great standalone epic fantasy, please check out BLACKDOG by K.V. Johansen. Let's read. This is BLACKDOG, Chapter 1, by K.V. Johansen. Evening prayers took place on the flat-topped bell tower that rose above the gatehouse. Otokus was not a particularly devout man. Prayer had always seemed a pointless ritual. The sun, sliding between the peaks at the western end of the lake, turned the Lisavakal's waters to molten copper, while the swallows made their last scrolling passes over the waves. The chief of the priestesses, whose title was simply Old Lady, swayed back and forth as she chanted the prayer that was chanted every evening. Thanks for the day past, hopes for the day to come, plentiful fish, millet in the terraced fields, fertile yaks, healthy babies, happy folk, peace and prosperity for the folk of the goddess Atalissa, the folk of the Lisavakal, which was both lake and town. The goddess met his eyes and smiled, a neat, correct figure standing against the west, patience itself in a small girl's body. Atalissa had heard the prayers as many times as he, the same words wearing the same deep grooves in the memory, until one did not hear them at all, or could not remember if the ceremony were ending, or had only just begun. She wore layers of stiff white silk embroidered in indigo and gold, cold rings in her ears, conical crown of gold filigree and turquoise plaques on her hair, dangling pearls over her brow. The priestesses whose turn it was to attend evening prayer fanned out before her, a flutter of indigo-blue gowns, except for the pair flanking her, who wore wide-legged blue trousers and shirts of scale armor, and carried broad-bladed spears. Their armed presence was a formality, as so much of life on the holy islet of the temple adjoining the island town was formality. There had been no attack on the temple in generations. Still, the warrior priestesses of Lissavakal were more than ceremonial guard for the living goddess. They were sought out by the villages of distant valleys when the raiders were troublesome, and they served as mercenaries, guarding wealthy travelers, gem traders, and the chieftains of the gold-washing villages on the wild mountain tracks. Otokis was more than a ceremonial guard himself. He remembered raiders coming up from the desert, seeking control of the gold-bearing rivers of the mountains. He remembered years when the communities of the high valleys warred amongst themselves, with the encouragement of their gods and goddesses or in defiance of their pleas. Born 40 winters before, he remembered centuries. He was the Black Dog, and the only man permitted on the temple islet. The words of the prayer ran on. Did they make any difference? And had they ever? Would the snows refuse to melt and fill the streams, or the hot desert winds sweep up from the north to blight the sprouting grain? Or the butter fail to come in the churns, if evening and dawn prayers were not said? Atalissa met his gaze, expressionless, black eyes deep, unreadable, in her round child's face. She had caught, he realized, the shape of that private thought. A year ago she would not have. She grew, slowly, into godhead. Prayers for them, dog, not for you and me, she told him, in the silent speech, mind to mind, that they shared. She had seen 8 summers, this incarnation of Atalissa. When Otokis first took on the burden of the Black Dog, Atalissa had been an elderly woman, older than his grandmother, older than the grandfather who served her as Black Dog before him. When Atalissa died herself, Otokis had wept as though she were his grandmother. But 9 months later, a newborn baby had stared up at him, cradled in his arms, and he had seen Atalissa recognize him, ancient familiarity in the infant's startled eyes. Atalissa lived, and died, and was reborn in a girl child conceived the day of her death. Some goddesses shaped themselves a physical body only when they desired, remaining for the most part a spirit within the waters or appearing as a mist or a dance of light. But Atalissa returned, mortal life after mortal life, in a human body. Thus it was said she never grew remote from the concerns and the suffering and the joys of her folk. That was part of the fervent love the people of Liskavale professed for her. There were only a handful of the goddess's folk gathered at the western end of the red lacquered bridge that arched from the temple islet across the channel to the island town. A pair of old women, eyes fixed devoutly on what to them must be only a cluster of blue figures and a tiny, occasionally bobbing gold crown. A young couple, their minds quite evidently on something other than devotions. A family in their best clothes, indigo and red, the wife wearing her bride gift circlet of gold coins across her weather-worn brow. They were not from town, by the cut of their clothes, peasants from one of the high villages. The children were paying more attention to the young couple than to the remote figures atop the tower. They used to pray on the town's edge of the bridge, the Black Dog remembered, meeting the townsfolk there. The folk had come to sing the hymns for Atalissa, and she had held their babies and blessed them, kissed the foreheads of the brides and the grooms, exchanged stories of the old days with the old folk who she had kissed as babies. What Otokis was, no tradition of the temple preserved, if it had ever been known. Old as the goddess, or older perhaps, god, demon, spirit of the wilds. Even the Black Dog no longer remembered what it had been before it became Atalissa's guardian, bound, like her, to human life. The litany tottered to the end. The women bowed to the goddess, who bowed in return, carefully, to keep the tall headdress from falling. And then she cried out suddenly and dropped to her knees. At the same time Otokis heard, smelt, felt a crack like a thunderclap all about them, hot metal, a shock like an avalanche, mowing trees before it. He had his arm around the girl the next moment, kneeling by her, sword drawn, though there was no one to defend her against what he could see. The armed priestesses had moved as he did, barring the stairs, the only obvious entry for threat. "The road," the old lady said. "Sweet Atalissa, save us! Look at the road!" Otokis passed Atalissa to the arms of Kea, who was Spear Lady, captain of the warriors, and joined Old Lady at the parapet. A black, shifting swarm covered the road on the southern shore of the lake, approaching the bridge to the town. "Sound the bells," he shouted back to the armed pair by the stairs. "Raiders!" The dog snarled in his soul, roused by the threat, and dangerous. Nothing the black dog could do here to defend the goddess. Old lady's hand shook as she gripped his arm. "They weren't there," she said, and her voice shook as well. "Otokis, they weren't there, even a few moments ago." "Wizardry," whispered the plump mistress of novices. "Or divinity." She looked at him, making it a question. "Wizardry," Otokis confirmed. "I smell it. And something else. But not a god. Not a goddess. A scent to the spirit like old ashes on stone in the hot tang of metal and fire. Not familiar, and yet... No, that strange hot smell of ash and metal was nothing the black dog could ever have smelt before. But it raised the dog's hackles, roared of danger and death and the need to defend, deafening Otokis to all else for a moment. It was not the time or the place. He forced the black dog quiet, calming it, calming himself. Whatever the threat was, it could not be mere wizardry. No lone wizard, no group of wizard he had ever heard of except in the oldest tales, could hide an army, certainly not so close to a deity's holy place. If they had been hidden, and not dropped from some other location, he had felt the air shatter. A previous guest on Pondering the Orb, JD Blackrose is an Ohio-based author of fantasy and urban fantasy who has a fantastic voice and the ability to craft sincere characters with charming relationships built on great pacing in her stories. This can be seen very well in her recent release Demon Kissed, the first book in the Summoner's Mark series by Bellbridge Books. Starring Rebecca Naomi Greenblatt, a powerful summoner of demons and spirits marked by a strange kiss on her wrist, she has recently ceased her profession to take up bartending at a remote Fey bar in Ohio. Filled with a colorful cast and a fairly fun magic system that keeps the story rolling through the trials, travails, and romance of a compelling character in Bex, the stakes slowly race from the local to the global in a setting far away from the typical venues of New York and LA. The story itself is very tight, and Blackrose wastes no time at all with the action on all fronts. There's really excellent economy of language to this book, and the pacing is quick, often ideal for the type of urban fantasy I enjoy because it goes beyond werewolves and vampires. There's real care in this work. If you're looking for great urban fantasy that comes with some very fun reading, this book and the entire Summoner's Mark series is a wonderful choice. Let's read Demon Kissed by JD Blackrose. Chapter 1. I was fat-shamed by a fortune cookie. Did you eat it and show it who was boss? I checked my rearview mirror. The black sedan slipped one lane left of mine, but it was still on my tail. Rebecca Naomi Greenblatt, are you even listening to me? Ah, all three names. Mickey only used them when she was angry, like our mother. My sister often droned on about her latest fad diet or workout, and when she did, I tuned her out, so it was a fair question. Also, she was on speaker, so I raised the volume to hear her better over the traffic. "Yes, Michaela," I said, stressing her first name, teasing her as only an older sister could. What did the fortune cookie say? I sped up and swerved around the red Jetta in front of me, earning a honk and a middle finger, but the black car still followed. Damn, they weren't even pretending to stay hidden now. Who were these people? The damn slip paper said, "No one looks good in skinny jeans." Mickey sniffed to express her displeasure. And I was wearing skinny jeans at the time. That's not even a fortune. Right? My point exactly. Maybe try another restaurant next time? I took a sharp turn right into a parking garage and zoomed up a down ramp, fishtailed around the curve, narrowly missing an oncoming dark green Ford Escape, and circled to the left, heading toward the exit ramp on the far side of the garage. The black car followed but didn't make it, slamming into the Escape. The crunch of metal on metal and the loud cursing echoed through the concrete lot. "Bex, what was that? Were you in an accident? Are you in trouble? It's that damn job of yours, isn't it?" I touched my neck where my locket used to be, wishing I still had it. Mickey wore a duplicate. "I stopped doing that job, Mix. I work at a bar now." "You say that, but for some inexplicable reason I can't visit you at this bar. You're still summoning, aren't you? Bex, you almost got killed 6 months ago." "I'm not summoning, and things happen to people in all kinds of jobs." "It's the kind of people you work with, Bex, and you know it. The scum of the earth." "Worked with, past tense, and they were desperate. They needed help, and I provided it. I'm sort of the only one who can do it, and you know that." "You don't help. You hand them a shovel so they can dig a deeper hole." Her voice was hot and angry, and I knew nothing I said would make a difference. We had had this argument 1,000,000 times. I sighed. It wasn't even my fault they made bad deals. Except that one time. That time it was my fault, and was the reason I gave up. My sister didn't believe me, and I couldn't blame her. It was true. She couldn't visit me at my new job. I worked at a Fay bar, and she, like any other normal, couldn't see the door or find the address. Mickey? Ruthie got her first tooth. After a pause, she said, "Your niece misses you, even though she's too little to say so." I know. I missed her too. All of them. Even my brother-in-law. Text me a picture? I will. She's so cute. It's a bottom one. Her mommy enthusiasm cut through the sadness, and I smiled. Does she have any more hair? You would know if you ever came by to visit, Auntie Bex. When can we see you? Shabbat dinner Friday? I squirmed in my car seat. Jonah, Mickey's husband, wasn't my biggest fan. He hid it from Mickey, but we had had words in private. Mickey didn't believe in the creatures I summoned, such as demons. She was aware some people did believe, but a little Dante type of hell with demons wasn't in her personal belief system. She knew I summoned bad things, but that was it. Jonah, however, understood that whatever people believed in, I could manifest and summon, and he didn't want my demon stank to come near his wife and daughter. I didn't blame him because he was totally correct. I owed a powerful demon named Valfar a favor for fixing the mistake that made me walk away from summoning, and I didn't know when he'd call it in. I lived on the edge of every minute, thinking he'd use the locket I'd given him to prick my soul, get my attention, and trade in his chit. Part of me hoped he would never do it. Another part of me wanted him to do it and get it over with. All of me lived in terror of what he'd asked me to do. For the bazillionth time in my life, I glanced up at the symbol on my inner left wrist. The sign of the devil, some people called it. The protection of Satan, said others. The mark of hell. Most people called it the kiss. It sort of did look like lips. The top curved like an upper lip, although to me it looked like an outline of a seagull, and beneath it, a V shape. Call it by any name you want. It made me one of a handful of people on Earth who could do what I could do. I was, or it had been, a summoner. I was born a summoner, although I hadn't known until my 13th birthday when the kiss appeared on my wrist. Mickey had been 11. I was 28 now, so I'd been living with it for a while. Mostly I summoned demons, but that's only because I had a lot of New Testament following, Dante-believing clients. In reality, I could summon anything from any theology, pantheon, or belief system. That was up to the client's beliefs, not mine. Once, using a pair of Wakizashi swords as a focal point, I'd summoned a particularly unhappy ancestor in the form of a dragon. The Japanese couple had paid a steep price for the knowledge they gained, and they'd lost the swords too, because the swords had disappeared with the dragon. No one asked to summon beings without power, meaning it was all dangerous, so despite wanting to see Mickey and Ruthie more than anything, until I figured out who was following me, I said the only thing I could and hoped that one day I still wouldn't be running from my past. Rain check? Sometimes in the course of music, we find the synthesis of a sound that is not only rooted in tradition, but takes great leaps forward in progression. This show is about melodic death metal, an epic genre full of passion, musicality, and genuine emotion. This show is also about the wide-open genre that is synthwave, which I believe to be the modern generation's Baroque, leading to the next neoclassical period where, once again, electronic music will usher in a vast transformation of what we hear and appreciate. Our next act, System96, is an embodiment of this. But this segment is about metal. This German epic metal band is the best of both worlds, combining lightning-fast chops and distortion coupled with electronic harmonies that wash over us. Kambrium is exactly what this show is about. From their album Synthetic Era, this is Creator of Dreams by Kambrium. From the homelands of my beloved South, System96 is an electronic musician from Atlanta with a body of work that just in the last 2 years is stunning. With liquid precision and some of the cleanest melody around the synthwave scene, this dynamic artist is sure to make an impact on the house genre very soon. There is always a way out of the old and into something new, especially when it is rooted in a love of tradition while looking forward. I hope this song opens a window for many of you. This track is called Aperture and comes from their 2020 debut album, Memories. This audio interview for our More segment is entitled International Security, Intelligence, and the Digital Age. It is hosted by myself and my friend Petey, an analyst, consultant, translator, and interpreter. Okay, here we go. We're recording.
All right.
And don't worry, I can edit all the fuck ups out later.
Okay.
So, hi everyone, welcome to Pondering the Orb. As always, I'm your host, wandering fantasy author Jay Requard, and we have a very special episode of More segment for Pondering the Orb. This segment is titled Intelligence and International Security in the Digital Age, and with me I have my friend, Petey. He is an analyst, interpreter, translator, and consultant, and he's here to answer a few questions with me tonight. How are you doing, Petey?
I can certify that I am respirating, sir. How are you doing this fine evening?
I'm doing well, also respirating. There's plenty, happening in the world, and I really thank you for taking your time out to speak with me today.
No, it's my pleasure. As you know, one of my soapboxes that I like to mount is making this very opaque industry, intelligence and nascent open source intelligence, and making it more understandable for people. So if I can, positively impact that for you, much less the broader audience, then I can sleep well tonight.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. This show really is trying to kind of reveal certain things for the audience that they haven't considered before. And I think with someone in the role that you're in, you can really help kind of pull back the veil on a world that I think a lot of people have some misunderstandings and misconceptions about. And I think tonight, with some of these questions, I would like to kind of clarify some things. So if there's any point in time that you want to step in and add something, by all means, feel free to.
Hmm.
But getting to the first question, I would actually like to start with something topical in the news, something that everyone's kind of talking about right now, and then we'll kind of drill down to the granular from there.
Love it.
So with the first question, with the FBI raid on Mar-a-Lago, residence of former President Donald Trump, we're entering an age where paper and digital are at a weird crossroads. But the security of both remains of vital concern to the upkeep of international security. Could you explain for our listeners why there is such concern about this potentially illegal withholding of documents from federal record keeping? And what is the actual worry in terms of what may have been exposed by the former president if he kept these documents unsecured and accessible to what now seems to be many, many witnesses?
Okay, yeah. So this is a rather big picture that's also somewhat granular question, um, which there's actually, if you can recall the Halcyon days of 2019, we have an object lesson, way back when. It's, the early days before COVID.
Hmm.
Um, there was a former U.S. Navy, then Booz Allen contractor for the NSA. He also received a warrant and an investigation by the FBI, where they found terabytes of data. He claimed to be a data hoarder, but amongst all of the information that he had stored was one piece of classified information. One relative to I believe it's last I heard, like 23 pieces of top secret. And we should take a brief moment here because I appreciate no small amount of explainers are going on broadcast news. When we're dealing with classified, there's three levels. You've seen it if you've seen a Jason Bourne movie: confidential, secret, TS. Um,
Right.
they all sound generally the same, but there's different descriptors to provide different levels of gravity for each one. So confidential would be, generally speaking, the legalese was damage national security if disclosed. Secret would seriously damage national security, and top secret would provide exceptionally grave damage. Confidential is pretty serious, but once you get to the level of like a top secret, we're talking millions, if not billions, of dollars of investment, people's lives, whether that's sources or people that are operating overseas. So Harold Martin, the NSA contractor, was brought up on 20 counts under, I believe, my memory is not perfect, 18 USC 793E. Uh, my memory's not perfect. I don't remember what the subcode is.
I won't hold
But
you to it.
thank you. My mentions are about to be eviscerated for having one piece of TS. That single document, he got 9 years in prison because that's the level of security that we're dealing with here. Um,
Right.
so one of the things with classified is it doesn't matter if it's digital or hard copy. It's whether or not it's being improperly stored, because regardless of the format, if someone that if it's disclosed or it's lost, the harm is there, regardless of how it's delivered. So that's kind of the concern and what's going on a lot. And the Trump news cycle of he didn't do it. If he did, it's not a big deal. If he did, but it's okay. We're all very familiar with the prior administration. We're in the midst of that, but the thing is, classified doesn't. It's agnostic, and there's not a whole lot of workarounds. The only problem, which was a rub with the entire prior administration, is there's no precedent and there's no standard for which to measure or look at or examine for when a president does something as unprecedented. A statement that's not been said ever, truly.
Mm-hmm.
A leak such as this, as it pertains. So forgive me for all the verbal pauses.
Yeah, of course.
Again, I like to use metaphors. Again, this field, this institution is rather opaque. So for a general audience, um, it's kind of hard to understand that. So we have this commensurate consequence for mishandling classified data, as we've explored. So, like, more prosaically, would you trust a bank or a hospital that left your birth certificate, your social security number, your account numbers, your financial information in a broom closet that anyone could walk into, just like in a open door room in the ER?
No, of course not. And, that's why we have HIPAA rules and stuff like that to protect people's information.
Exactly, and that's kind of the contrast for when, in the event that you come across somebody that is minimizing this or suggesting that it's not that big of a deal. It's that, but instead of just like yours or my or some hypothetical individual's private medical information, it's trenches of people's data worth millions, if not billions, of dollars, and having people's lives on the line. It's pretty significant, and the reason that there's not a lot of opining from national security law experts, just NatSec or Intel people, is because not just within the history of the United States, which is already pretty significant, within the history of intelligence and espionage, we've never seen something like a former executive just walk away and say that he can have this stuff. So we don't know what to do. It's the Intel community having the same crisis that a lot of the country had during that prior administration. It's haunting us.
I have to ask, kind of as an ancillary to this question before we move on to the next one. Um, it seems to me that one of the big benefits of at least Western intelligence agencies are their ability to plan for contingencies. Has this never been considered as a real risk that at least American intelligence agencies would have to be dealing with? Was the thought of this so anathema to you and your colleagues that there is no real legal framework to deal with this? So I have to admit, I mean, I have to imagine to a certain extent there might not be a conceptual framework to deal with this. Would that be correct?
It's partially, the other factor is that for your average analyst, even your average person in the equivalent of a C-suite for these agencies, the contingencies of, like, what if the president or somebody in Congress mishandles this information? What do we do? It's not that it's anathema; it's that that's not necessarily their task. Like, the task,
Right.
if you're at that level, is, my task is rendering the best possible product with providing decision advantage to my customer. The C-suite is, I just have to keep operations going. I need to continue my deliverables.
Mm.
The impetus would be on the NatSec lawyers, and there are lawyers that are maintaining legality or creating case law through courts, a number of different courts, including FISA. And I'm not suggesting that the blame falls on them, because there's not, the arena for this law to be created would have been Congress, which, again, they're rather productive right now. But
Yeah.
it's one of those things where we knew the train was coming. We, as in the state, the nation, and but we were still constantly shocked at like how craven and uh, let's leave it at craven the behavior of the administration was. So no, I again, I'm speculating wildly. I was not in a lot of these rooms. I do not speak for the entire IC. I wouldn't want to, but I think it was a matter of, if anything, uh, congressional ineptitude, and a lot of people thinking, well, no, surely he's not going to do that. When time and again, when we asked ourselves that hypothetical, he did or worse.
Okay, understood. We may circle back around to this because
Hmm.
you raised a possible question, but let's see if we can get back to it in a little bit. Transitioning from an acute issue facing the intelligence community as we go further into the digital age, if I may ask you to, with a difficult attempt at a summation, with the emergence of possible assimilation of process-oriented artificial intelligence used by militaries, facial recognition and alteration, social media bots, public disinformation campaigns basically played out in the open, and a a global destabilization brought about by a relatively age-old enemy who seems to be losing more than they are gaining from it. What is the nature of intelligence today, especially in a post-pandemic world?
This is a huge question.
Yeah, my
It's
apologies.
no. This is not what I'm paid for, but these are the questions that I think about when I'm commuting, when I'm staring at a blank wall after work, on my second responsible pour of wine. Um, Frankly, uh, the state of the discipline is in upheaval. Not, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. What we're seeing is, yeah, it's almost a geologic upheaval. The last of the Cold War guard, the real cloak and dagger types, are all retiring out. So that same C-suite is being stocked now with mostly post 9/11 types. It's not even a matter of that cliche that air quotes the game has changed. It isn't even it hasn't changed. It's just there isn't a game now. Recalling
Interesting.
what you outlined here, Sam Huntington, quite wrongly, I have to note, opined that the post Cold War conflicts would be cultural and religious. His book, The Clash of Civilizations, which is,
Hmm.
I would not encourage anybody to read that. And
Yeah,
he made those statements to mask
very
his own bigotry.
outdated.
Yes, and he made those statements to mask his own bigotry. It bears
Yes.
saying that and holding him to account for it. But what we've seen in the past 20 years is that the future of conflict isn't cultural religious, it's one of narrative, which gets to the specific nature of your question. Malinformation, bot campaigns, astroturfing, all of these are serving to subvert the narratives of one state for another. So, like, you're a storyteller yourself. How are narrative conflicts fought?
So narrative conflicts are usually traditionally here in the West taken in three modes. Is usually man versus man versus society, or man versus nature.
And so I don't know the big picture. I'm researching and thinking a lot about OSINT. I'm getting ready to take some classes. I'm getting ready to lecture a little bit at some other classes about OSINT.
Oh
Um,
wow, very neat.
this is something that is kind of I've fallen backwards into thinking a bit too big, uh, abstractly about the discipline. But what we're seeing now with all this overturn with AI, the facial recognition, all of these things that you outlined, is narrative can now be verified or devalidated in real time, and that's where OSINT's coming into play. Whereas before, all of this technology, the black budget of the intelligence community or military operations, was used to advantage one state or over another. The advantage is rather cheaply afforded through cyber, through a lot of these campaigns. So where intelligence is pivoting now is sanitizing these narratives.
Mm. So when it comes to sanitizing a narrative, going into the future, without breaking any sort of protocols or bringing into question anything that the IC community is currently doing to protect the nation.
Mhm.
What is really the best way? And this may get into the larger question I have next about OSINT. Um, well, actually, let's actually get into that question because I think it feeds right into it. Media plays such a big part in how information is being disseminated globally and locally, and I'm wondering if as you're continuing to speak now, to the continuing challenges that things like social media and private centralized networks have brought to your profession. But kind of going off that question, when it comes to disseminating narrative, especially when you have artificial intelligence now, is it something that is surmountable for the IC to do, or is there a worry at some point that the progress of these platforms, especially AI,
Mhm.
might get ahead?
Okay. So one thing that I would say is very oftenly, and I would say that this is somewhat a vestige of like the Nixonian era
Hmm.
perception of the Intel community, is that there is some sort of opposition between the two when really, like everything else, the Intel community consumes media. Like capital M media is priceless for an intelligence analyst. The disparity between a foreign and domestic media narratives is just as valuable as the two narratives themselves. Um, and how do I want to say this? Media controls people, like not in like that Dan Brown sense of like there's a cabal controlling something. No, it's it's that it's something much more fundamental and intuitive. Again, as a storyteller, this is rather I know this is going to be really obvious for you, which is that like humans like narrative. A lot of times when I've had to give briefings to people, you don't just say like some statistics that supports it. You're telling a story.
Absolutely.
And as you know, in a lot of the spaces where we've interacted and our mutual networks, I should pretty much have a sign at this point where that I can tap at. The narrative is normative. Um, you've seen me say it
Yeah.
dozens of times
Oh yeah.
this year. Um, so how this is handled is that rather than that sort of oppositional framing, which again is rather Nixonian, I believe there's, obviously I don't speak for the entire IC. There's some disparity there, but I tend to see media, capital M, as another source, which is where OSINT comes into play. It certainly is part of OSINT. And so we can use that to refine or cite or improve or synthesize our overall product. And then likewise, because whatever we're sourcing to, even if it's born out of AI, or it's something that's screen captured from a private network, um, if it's not classified, or it's redacted to a level where it can be released at the public level, then that's just going to provide a stronger argument to say like, okay, so here's proof of these people saying, like, owning the fact that this is fake, or like here's all of the receipts. And that's kind of the overall shift that we're seeing within the community. So to the nature of like the question you're asking directly, my concern for the average person that's just walking the streets, that's going to
Hmm.
Starbucks and getting their coffee, isn't a matter of radicalization. That's invoked a lot. It occupies a lot
Right.
of headspace online. Um, I'm not even particularly concerned about being a vector for malinformation, which again, if you any infographic on Instagram.com, um, those are just the state of the polluted infosphere that we live in now, man. Like my worry is burnout. Like that is what concerns me at a constant. Like our parents, you and I, they had the local and national newspapers and nightly news. They saw the premiere of 24-hour news networks. You're terminally online just like me. On the
Hmm.
internet, on any of these apps, 24 minutes can last hours or days as events unfurl. So
Right.
like burnout, whether it's from being overwhelmed or doom scrolling, is built into a lot of models for actors generally. I'm not even going to attribute that to a specific state. And that is the thing that concerns me, because once somebody is burnt out, like the cooldown time for them to be able to be ready to be mobilized or respond or give support and care to the people that are in their network, that is that is what concerns me, because that's it it's a net harm for the individual and the community.
Yes, I fully agree, and I actually think that is becoming more and more of not only a societal problem that's affecting all levels of community and all levels of cooperation and corporation, but at the same time, I think, and this may be me putting on my conspiracy hat. One thing that I remember about Osama bin Laden's goals when it came to 9/11 is that he wanted to invoke such a response in America that we would potentially economically cripple ourselves.
Mhm.
Um, that clearly didn't happen because we're not economically crippled. I'm not going to say we're economically healthy, but we're not economically crippled. Um, when it comes to, getting away from the Nixonian idea that there's kind of like this opposition out there,
Mhm.
is the goal of our adversaries and our enemies now not necessarily to instill an idea or a fear or an illusion that causes us to discombobulate and disunify as a society, but is there a strategy to just kind of wear people down on the other side now? Like just
Yes.
hit them with so much?
Um, the blunt answer is yes. Um, what and it's not even just a matter of the perception of like a Hegelian other, like some other state that's doing that, because as you and I both survived, which that's a load bearing verb, the previous administration, and burnout was concretely part of the model, the outrage model during that administration of just flooding them. We can quote Steve Bannon directly, flood the zone with shit. Like that was something he put on wax. So like, yes, that's part of it. Another factor, and I am now going to become the grizzled intel guy that uses media and stories as a metaphor, but I've been in this field for about 15 years now. I'm allowed to. Um, there's a lot of validity with something that was said, ironically enough, in Iron Man 2 by Whiplash, where when he's arrested and RDJ's Tony Stark goes to confront him in prison, and he's just like, "What do you think you were going to accomplish, dude?" And he just kind of says, "I just needed to make you bleed. You were a god, and once I do that, doubt is instilled." And to that effect, success was garnered. If we start getting into like what's the end state, what's the purpose of the exercise for a lot of cyber activity and what we're seeing online and in open source, which is to say social media platforms, it's it's part of that burnout, but it's also the appreciation that like the United States or the West or whatever you want to model it as can't be everywhere all the time. Um, so
Thank you for bringing that up. I don't think people realize that when it comes to just the general flow of information and awareness that we have on a global level. Nobody can be everywhere all the time, so a lot of the things that happen sometimes a lot of people miss until it's too late. And that's not a fault of the intelligence community, it's not necessarily a fault of government. It's just humans can only, even with our technology at the heightening levels that it's rising to, we can only do so much.
yeah, like this is a question that's asked. I somewhat controversially within academia and within my field have opined that journalism and intelligence analysis are pretty much the same thing. There are minor differences that come down to like budget, overall audience, means of collection, but it's pretty much
Agreed.
you're gathering information for a customer, providing into a concise narrative to give them decision advantage to some end. Whether that's being better informed or being able to make a policy decision, there's the variability. Um, there's questions that are asked about that in newsrooms every day where it's like, how did we not know about this sooner? Technology is capital T technology has connected us in myriad ways, both good and bad. But what that means is that, you know, on any given day, like there's going to be 15 and a half different controversies, and someone is liable to confront you that you're not better aware, better up to speed with one of the ones that has impassioned or inflamed them, and we can't. Like the human cognition can't. I can't be aware of everything that's going on in the world all at once, despite the assertion that several of my friends, not you, but some of our mutuals will DM me and be like, "Hey, buddy, what's this headline mean?" And I field it as quickly as I can, but it's like I can't be on top of everything all the time. No one person, no one office, no one institution can.
Right. Absolutely. Well, I actually have, based off of that, a question that is not on the outline I provided you earlier, but hopefully it will hit correctly here. Explain the aspect of alchemy when it comes to gathering, disseminating information for the purposes of providing open source intelligence. You touched on it already, but it is one thing to turn lead into gold, but how does one access this vast wall of information constantly thrown at us from everywhere at everything on a daily basis and actually go about uncovering the needed truths that really need to be considered and maybe prioritized?
Oh boy. Oh, so this isn't an elevator pitch. This is an elevator seminar on how to do OSINT, which I think I can do this. Um, we're gonna start front, work to back. Turning lead into gold. So whether you're writing a term paper, you're doing any sort of research, you have your initial single source. For purposes of this exercise, let's say someone is curious about Russian troops going into Ukraine, since that's also very topical. Um, they hop on to twitter.com and they see a couple of tweets from some account that shows a bunch of Russian dudes in a very clearly marked, because this is all academic and hypothetical, very clearly marked city in Ukraine. They go, okay, so I have that. Now, you have a single source. You have this one piece of photo evidence. What you would then want, and this is where the alchemy comes into play, is, and some of my ire with basement OSINTers. There's a lot of disparaging ways that we can put it. Just people that novices that don't quite know what they're doing, but they want to cosplay as though they are intelligence analysts because it makes them feel cool.
Oh, big spies?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
It's not that I have an issue. It's not an issue with people trying to inform. It's just an issue of they're making sloppy tradecraft mistakes. So hopefully, if any one of them is listening, they can learn something here. You have that single source. Now, what you would want to do to make a better product overall is not find another piece of reporting like from AP or Reuters that's saying, oh, according to this tweet that had this picture, Russian troops are now there. What you would want is, if you can find it within the confines of this metaphor, transcripts of a radio broadcast vectoring Russian troops to there, which there are people that do radio collect all the time, just like there is numerous Twitter accounts that are just publishing airplanes, just like taking off from this airport going to another airport, and you start gathering that information as best you can. So then within the confines, and again hypothetical, scrolling through Russian soldier, like some private in the Russian army's Twitter account, and then he's posting that like he's in this place because he took a selfie because he's an idiot, and aggregating this so that you're getting multiple different kinds of information that's all in agreement to make a single product stronger overall. Because if you're just using the same thing and you're taking like a single source of information, it's not particularly strong. So you want to validate it, and having multiple kinds of the same kind of information, photo evidence in this situation, would make it a little bit stronger. If you can synthesize that with a number of different kinds of information, again, like radio transmissions, if someone were to, in this situation, leak Russian troop movements, like the document, the order that's coming down from a general or a colonel, all of those things make products stronger overall. And how you go about doing that, there's a lot of different ways. With OSINT, I have to kind of abandon this metaphor briefly. We have the Internet of Things, so there's a lot of different ways where AI is being used to just automatically post this information.
Right.
The tweets for planes that are taking off, that is one example. I'm trying to think of a couple others. There are a number that are just automated processes that are getting pushed out, and then you just have to comb through the data, invoking David Foster Wallace. It's not a matter of you have all of the data in the world. You just can't be bored because you're gonna have to sift through so much to find it, to find what the overall direction is.
Yes. Yeah, that is a perfect metaphor for the issue, and great David Foster Wallace reference. Hopefully, we won't be doxxed for it. Um, there's such division around that man, like even to this day. Um,
I
but
controversially, I think Pale King, I enjoy it more than Infinite Jest, which is it's an incomplete work. I like his nonfiction a lot. I can we've talked about this privately. We don't need to have it be a whole segment on your pod, but people need to warm up to the idea that you can hold disparate ideas in the same hand at the same time. Like I can enjoy his work and rectify at the same time that like he was a monster to the people that he dated. That
oh yeah,
I'm I'm not gonna sit here and apologize for that. Just like no, he provided very cogent and prescient insights into what it's like for the human condition and what it's like to be in his demographic, let's say.
oh I can actually provide a little bit more severe and somewhat more topical for people that may not know David Foster Wallace. I had a debate with an American history specialist today, and we were talking about Washington. And from the public consciousness, Washington's our first president, arguably one of the greatest presidents. Um, but the actual person, if you look at it, is cloaked and shrouded in so many layers of gray. He was a slaveholder. You could argue that he created a whiskey monopoly that screwed over many farmers in the early days of America. Um, you know, he and Martha had some very weird relationships, and he had some very weird relationships with his kids. And at the same time, you know, you have to recognize that Washington kind of committed a miracle at in his era by refusing kingship at a time
Hmm.
where like he could have easily just said, "Yeah, okay, put the crown on me," but he had the forethought, despite all of his faults, and there are many, and they're deep, and they're troublesome, and they're inhumane. You still have to be able to recognize that, like, the decisions that were made were important, and there's still value in those decisions. Just like there's value in David Foster Wallace, even though as a human being, there's a lot to be desired.
Exactly.
Now,
Yes.
I do think like one thing, and I think that this is something from our modern era, and I know I'm getting off the questions, but pardon me, we kind of got into this. Um, and I'll keep it very short. One thing that I find kind of disturbing, and I see this in media a lot too, is that there's this kind of when we okay, so in publishing, and this is really an aside, and I promise we'll get back. You've probably heard the name Marion Zimmer Bradley, Miss of Avalon. She wrote a lot of feminist fiction in the sci-fi and fantasy space, which was really revolutionary for its time and really defined a lot of feminist genre fiction going forward. Well, when she died, we found out through her kids that she had been sexually abusing them and other children. And suddenly, the industry acts like there was no Marion Zimmer Bradley, the Mr. Avalon didn't exist. But we need to have those conversations like, no, she did exist. And as important as those books are, we really need to discuss how far do we go in terms of appreciating authors. You and I are pro wrestling fans.
Hmm.
How far do we really go appreciating Chris Benoit? I
Yes.
think it's one of those things that like we have to have those conversations, and they have to sometimes be gray and gritty, but they're
Hmm.
important conversations to have. And I think the media does a big disservice by kind of I don't want to call it whitewashing, but everything gets, I wouldn't even say painted down to a shade of grade. Everything gets beige washed now,
Hmm.
where there's very much a homogenization. It kind of getting back to the question of intelligence, and getting back to the alchemy of open source intelligence. One thing that you brought up, in kind of going about the process of confirming data and being able to disseminate it into a viable or informative product. When it comes to OSINT,
Hmm.
is there a level of objectivity that can be maintained, or do you have to always be very, very careful about the premise? And is there a problem with having a premise going into open source intelligence? Like, if you're a leftist, is is there a danger like putting your leftism before the intelligence, or is there a way to, I guess how I'm saying is like, I guess what I'm asking is there a synthesis between political outlook and being good at OSINT,
Mhm.
or does is objectivity just kind of a false construction that we kind of use?
Sir, much smarter people than you and I combined have reflected at length about post-positivism. That is a three-finger of Scotch question, but I will give it my best. I will do my very best here.
Thank you,
Um,
and I apologize.
That's fine. This is it's good. It's good to explore and explicate this because first of all, there's a lot of different kinds of intelligence for scale. So tactical, operational, strategic, which is do we move these three guys in this direction? Do we move these three divisions in this direction? Do we invade country? Um, and in addition to that, there can be, intelligence for the military, intelligence for politicians, and those are going to be very two different products. Just as economic intelligence that you're giving to Janet Yellen, hypothetically, would be rather different because what their needs are. Because the whole purpose of this is to provide decision advantage. Um, they're all going to have different needs. So uh, when it comes to this question, I've experienced this in my time as an analyst. I have seen people that were editorializing content and reporting, and I
Mm-hmm.
removed them from my office when I had the authority to do so. I was like, "You're not going to work here anymore because I can't stand for this. I did not authorize your products to be released. I'm sending you to be remediated and go back into a reporting class." Um, but to the real spirit and the heart of the question, it comes down to epistemic humility. It comes down to the scientific method. You don't go in the direction of where you want the conclusion to be. You go in the direction of the data. So within that previous hypothetical, right, we're curious
Mm-hmm.
about where Russian troops are moving within Ukraine. Again, this is a notional exercise using contemporary events.
Of
Let's
course.
say that our basement analyst sees one picture on Twitter that shows Russian in the Donbass region, some unnamed city that I won't make one up. And they start looking into the data. Now, the data that's publicized online, through a number of different means, whether it's TikToks, some private on. He wouldn't be posting on Instagram. He would be making a TikTok on a tank. But there's disparity between all of that. You could force the intelligence to suit your means, and that has been done occasionally throughout history, not just by the United States, but in numerous countries.
Oh yeah,
Um,
back to ancient times.
yes, or and this is something that I've tried to impress upon people when I've lectured, when I've had the authority as a trainer, and I've run targets before, which is you go where you go where the intelligence, where the information leads you, and that's what you report because you're synthesizing as an analyst. You're synthesizing the information, so you need to follow what conclusions bear out of that. I feel very passionately about that because the alternative is it's malinformation. Broadly speaking,
Right.
whether it's intentional or unintentional, it's malinformation. It's no good. It's bunk. Um, but yeah, it's more abstractly. This is a bit beyond the nature of your question. You know,
Hit me. Yeah.
it's so validating, taking your large data set and then figuring out where the data is going. There's a sub question therein of, is this data valid or not? Like, do we know that this
Mm,
is not false information, or fake news, or excuse me, what have you? But there's also the fact that and this gets to synthesizing different kinds of information, because if all you have are TikToks, that can be a photo shoot, that can be arranged, that can be fake.
right.
That's why you want a lot of different kinds of imagery, of communications, of people claiming something, gathering all of this different kinds of data, because once that's synthesized, like the chance or the probability of an actor having people talk about something, being seen doing something, and transmitting information about that event, moving troops within a Ukraine, that's much less probable. You can fake one thing, like you can fake one kind of media narrative. Having a full troop movement,
Right.
at that point, you can't be faulted for being wrong.
Yeah, because at some point logistics, plays out. Um, Taking a step away from these current issues that we've been touching upon, would it be possible? And this is a very difficult question, and I know I've been throwing a lot of heaters tonight. So there's two ways to answer this question. If you want to pick one or just deal with one side or the other, by all means, feel free. But taking a step away from the current issues at hand, would it be possible for you to provide the listener with a sort of mini history of intelligence and clandestine services in the digital age as it progressed from the first military intranets to the bot campaigns we see today on Twitter? Or, if this question is too broad, is there a moment in history for you as an analyst, interpreter, translator, and consultant where the digital world finally came into its own in terms of its impact it had on international security and the intelligence community as well?
Yeah, honestly, this question rips. Like, this question genuinely owns. So for the first part, like a mini history, I can't get too much into that part without violating some Encyclopedia Britannica size NDAs. So as a consolation, we're gonna explicate the other half with great gusto. Um, so the U.S. government and a lot of other countries and just private enterprises, they have all loved tech and data, dating all the way back to like the IBM System 360 back in the 1950s when computers took up the space of like a whole room. The digital age, within the context of the question, the digital age coming into its own, as you and I would recognize it, as someone that's on the internet with a smartphone today, that there's two parts that there's two events that I would point to. The first one would be the coming out party, like it coming out, not necessarily being born, but showing up on the scene. And that we're gonna have to jump back about 10 years to 2010 in the Arab Spring.
Wow. Okay. So that early. Yeah.
Because
I'm,
no, please go ahead.
well, like the Arab Spring is such an important moment in world history, and it's kind of been forgotten. And it's very good to hear that is recognized for its not only such it was such a big event for global upheaval, and I think you know full disclosure for everyone at home, I'm not much of a closet leftist, but um, I think when it came to the idea of spreading democracy, it was a really big moment where the internet actually played a big part. But correct,
Absolutely.
correct me if I'm wrong, of course. If there's another aspect that I'm missing.
No, that's kind of why I personally describe it as the coming out party for the digital era. During that stretch of time with the Arab Spring, we saw Syria, Iran, Yemen, Tunisia, Egypt. I could go on. States and militaries working tirelessly to prevent coordination and awareness of the event of the democratic people's call for autonomy and agency against rather authoritarian regimes in all of those states. Um, and we had at the time, we being the West, because it wasn't just an IC factor, it wasn't just a United States factor. This was the best and brightest of nascent startups across the West collaborating with their counterparts in a number of governments and protesters and telecom companies to ensure that connectivity for tweeting, for broadcasting, for not just for journalists, but for the protesters themselves to be able to coordinate so that they would safely be able to call for these things, that wasn't lost. Um, that was really a situation where the relationships that were born out of that, the good thing was the digital age came into its own. It hit the scene and it hit it very hard with a major significant impact because like yeah, you can have an operative on the ground in the middle of Cairo feeding information back to DC through whatever means. But it's completely different for that. This gets back to the narrative idea that we were talking about earlier, than to have like an act like dozens of people live tweeting these events with footage on proto smartphones and it being on global news. It's complete, it's narratives at scale. And I feel obliged to point out a lot of those relationships that were born out of that have had some consequence with the sort of like I worked at Google and now I work in the IC going back and forth because capitalism is going to capitalism.
Yes.
More contemporarily, so that's like the coming out party. More contemporarily, the previous U.S. administration, and just generalizing it at that. Also, I'm going to say in the middle of this, my views don't necessarily represent the views of my current employer or any future employer.
Of course, we are merely conjecturing and having a fun old time. There's nothing
Yes,
professional about this at all.
yes. So the previous administration and its myriad associated conflicts with the intelligence community, leading into this current administration, the Biden administration, and the invasion of Ukraine, that's been something of a bit of a test bed for that landscape upheaval that I was talking about in intelligence as a discipline, right? Um, because now we're getting away from can we use intelligence to provide decision advantage for an individual, for a congressperson, for a president, for an agency, for an alliance, and more can we use intelligence to sanitize and disprove faulty claims with reviewable data. And that is like we have not really seen that in the history of the country, even dating back to like FDR and World War II, where
Mm-hmm.
the information was secured and it wasn't meant for public consumption. And there's some reasons for that. Ways and means is a very real thing. Um, so when it comes down to the digital age and these new technologies coming into their own, I don't think we've seen that yet because OSINT as a medium is a hyper object. It's so large that like we haven't mapped out or appreciated it for everything that it can do because the aperture is so wide now, and it impacts so many different things because it's aggregating all public facing content and synthesizing it to find patterns. That's that's like unimaginable in how large it is compared to. I want you to look at this office building and figure out what they're doing.
Asking kind of a preamble to the next question, but it's connected directly to this. And we've
Mm-hmm.
touched on artificial intelligence already. And knowing that you can only reveal so much in perhaps nothing at all, um, we're obviously at the point where people are already experimenting and integrating AIs into their process oriented systems and just their general discipline of getting things done.
Mm-hmm.
How quickly is AI advancing the quote unquote sanitation of
Mm-hmm.
information, and how much is it hindering it? And without getting into specifics, like, is it okay? A basic kind of bottom lining this question: is AI a net positive or a net negative going into the future,
I think AI.
or is it still too early to tell? Is it still too nascent?
Yes, it's absolutely too nascent. I would say relative to open source and digital communications having its coming out party and its sort of test bed. I don't think AI has particularly had its coming out party yet, because the only real things that I can think of that would be relative as a comparison would be, the Internet of Things web. That's not Web 3.0, but the Internet of Things just sort of automated pushing out data to social. Your refrigerator needs new milk, and like that. That's your refrigerator's informing you that you need more milk. But that's not AI, not in like the way that we're talking about here.
Right, correct.
I will say, computers as they currently exist, even with quantum, are not very good at intuition. They're not particularly good at inferences, certainly, and finding patterns. That's the human brain. We love narrative and we find patterns. Um, so I don't foresee that like within the Intel community it's going to be used a lot for that. But where I can see AI being very useful as a tool or a resource is one, developing and delivering counter narratives. It would be certainly a very good resource for an opposition or a red team. Red team being a term for an opposition team that is offensive oriented. Blue team is a term for defense oriented collectives. But also AI as a means to scrape through those yottabytes of data and find things that are aggregated that are just lost, like this, this data set or this signature on the blockchain is also we've seen it also used here, and here on places that are not, far flung on the internet, and being able to aggregate all of that, because that's man hours that we can offload to an AI that can be better spent synthesizing that information where AI can't do that.
Right.
That's the best and the most that I've seen it currently. Obviously, there are a lot. I can't walk into every room, so there might be some dudes that are working somewhere on some real cool stuff that I haven't seen and may never see.
Right. So this is a purely analytical question, but as many of my questions are, also kind of an abstract one. When you think of the idea of keeping a nation safe when you think of well, I'm sorry, let me rephrase this. What do you think of the idea of keeping a nation safe in late 2022? I understand if there's some necessary distance, as always, needed in your answer to keep things like procedure and protocol intact, but kind of artfully editing this question, um, what is that definition now, especially in a post pandemic world of in the IC? And I can imagine there's a myriad of definition to this. But when you think of keeping a nation safe in 2022, where we are right now, what does that really look like for someone working in the IC? Because, philosophically speaking, I'm one of those people that kind of accept that there's no such thing as 100% safety. There's always a high level of risk to the system, and there's also things that you cannot predict. As we've mentioned previously, you can't see everything all at once. So what does it mean to keep a nation safe in 2022 for people within the IC community? And this might just be a definition for you, of course. So the floor, sir,
Yeah.
is all yours.
So we'll step with some qualifiers for what a lot of other people would see, and then we'll get into the weeds a bit on me. Again, Cold War types, they're retiring out. And the sort of post 9/11 crowd is migrating into the C-suite, a bit overdue in my opinion. But for a lot of them, security is mitigating a sort of perceived threat that there are organizations and state and non-state actors that hate the American way of life, and they just want to, destroy well, they wouldn't call it an empire, but we'll move on.
Right.
I personally, as a rebuttal, think that mode of thinking is Pollyannish, frankly, despite the violence that's implicated with it. It's very rooted in the immediacy and the viscerality of a post 9/11 world. Go figure. For a lot of analysts, their idea of safety and security is going to be understanding the reason why a target set exists, why they are assigned to it, why it needs to be collected, and prosecuting it to the very best of their ability to ensure, the tiny sliver of land of things that they cover is maximally prosecuted for safety for whatever the threat is that target or that subject provides. For me, oh boy, I'm a bit more hawkish than the prior, a lot of my contemporaries and a lot of some of my management, because after my time outside of the IC when I stepped away to, get into academia, to grow and develop myself a bit more personally before coming back to it, I kind of look at things now, both pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, and I ask, like, what even is a state? And,
Mm.
and I'm not asking this in the anarchistic sense of like abolishing private property. Like, what is Westphalian sovereignty in this codified idea of a state? Like a plot, Westphalian sovereignty is a plot of land with borders and self-determination. But like,
Mm-hmm.
we occupy a nearly global codependent marketplace. So like, a farm protest in Mexico will hike the rates for your Chipotle down the street. What does safe even mean? I think a lot about,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah,
like,
absolutely. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Great question. Go on. Sorry, but yeah,
no,
think
it's
about this all the time. I really do. So yeah, go on. I'm all ears.
when you're asking that question, I'm reminded of a this guy Robert Mueller. You might have heard of him. About
Hmm.
10 years ago, he made this observation at a public speech, I think at Georgetown, and I'm paraphrasing again. I don't have perfect recall, and again, it was like 10 years ago. But he basically said there's two kinds of companies in the United States. There are those that have been hacked by China, and those that don't know they've been hacked by China.
Mm.
So again, doubling back to the sort of thought terminating question, what does digital safety and security mean when like Israel can launch Stuxnet against Iran, shut down nuclear development, and that is a field of tactic that is just accepted now. When the
Right.
Russian Internet Research Agency can flood the comment section on this podcast when it's published with just garbage, I don't know what safety and security means. Like, and if I did know, I would I'd either be a fool or a well-paid fool, frankly. Um, what I do know, to answer your question as best I can, um, is that we haven't seen how we can apply a lot of this tech, these new media, because I can't even describe us as tech. It's a medium at this point. Um, it hasn't been mapped out or appreciated for what it is. Like, I deeply struggle. Like, how do we define those things? Like, because going over the things that I just outlined, if our markets are so codependent that a freight strike will cost billions of dollars per week, not just for the United States but globally. Um, Also, support union workers, obviously, or like we have the threat of a cyber operation shutting down access to our water filtration systems, our power and electric, or as been seen very recently in parts of Europe, um, just shutting down access to boarding flights, causing customers and outages for tens of thousands of travelers, or just our domestic narrative, the polity of our discourse being laden with misinformation. If all of those things are just codependent and correlated and connected with one another globally, honestly, you can't measure safety and security at a state level anymore. Now we're talking about safety and security for like people. Um,
Yes. Yes.
and
Yes. 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 I just woke up my cat. Yes.
it's a
Sorry.
much bigger ask. And I think that's, I didn't stop to consider this previously, but like in talking about this with you, I think that might be what's driving this sort of change and shift in how intelligence is used by the Biden administration to be more public facing, because it's like, no, we can't use this to benefit ourselves at a state level. Like, it needs to be in the narrative, otherwise these risks will happen.
Right. Well, kind of touching on it for a second, I think, you turned me on to Mark Fisher's Capital Realism, and even though it is an outdated book in many aspects, one thing that Mark Fisher touches on exactly is you have to, the problem with capitalism in many ways is that it refuses and it openly tries to deter people from getting to the center of an issue. Because if you get to the actual center of the issue, you have to implicitly question the profit motive. I think that since we're facing so many global crises all at once, I agree with you. I think the Biden's more public facing attitude is trying to take into account this kind of idea that there is no, you know, one thing that when I was in undergrad, I was already starting to debate with some of my professors was 9/11 came around and really, I think, destabilized the idea of um, infinite sovereignty. Like the
Hmm.
moment the towers went down and a hole was put in the Pentagon and another plane crashed down in Pennsylvania, the entire illusion that history had ended and America had won was over.
Hmm.
And when, when Fukuyama is basically disproven and the providence that everyone was expecting after the fall of the Soviet Union doesn't take place, I think we all have to really ask the question, especially now. And I have another question about intelligent and international security I want to ask you. But I think when it comes to the definition of a state, just getting into the internet and media, like you've touched on in this conversation, the more the internet, and not even the Internet of Things, but I think we have two different media zeitgeists now. I think we definitely have kind of like a mainstream media narrative zeitgeist where it's the stuff you read in Newsweek, it's the stuff you read in the newspaper, it's the stuff that you read on Facebook or however their
Hmm.
algorithm will aggregate it for you. But I also think that there is, to a certain extent, local digital information, state level digital information, and international digital information that kind of is painting its own picture now of a world that is not necessarily unified around the idea of states or sovereignties anymore. But I think there is, and I think you see this, of course, like you said, we support unions on this podcast. I think that there's such a I think there's starting to be a global recognition that since the economic system is so interlaced on a global level to where if there is a strike in Mexico, the price of your Chipotle really does go up. I think everyone is starting to realize that there is this kind of humanistic need to have some sort of labor. I don't want to sound like a communist to anyone, but like there is some sort of need for a collective organization to handle these larger issues. And if you really address that question, I think it gets back to like your overall abstract question: what really is the purpose and function of a state? And
Hmm.
I fully agree with you. That is something that's going to be so hard to define now going forward. Um, is there anything that you would like to add? I know I just spoke a lot there.
No, it's aside from Frankie, Professor Fukuyama really took a swing and a miss. I won't pass up on an opportunity to be like, yeah, buddy, a truck stop that is the end of history, certainly. But otherwise, no.
Well,
These are ideas that we're going to be wrestling with. I'm working on a piece of personal writing right now at the moment, and I kind of make the passing observation that you know in the year 2000, I was getting ready to start playing a video game that I anticipated for a long time, and I had no idea that in the next year, the sort of naivete and insulation of having the world and ocean away, and that insulated the United States from any harm, would be
mhm,
upended, and then like once in a lifetime disasters would happen biennially after that for
yeah,
the rest of my lifetime.
yeah,
Um, and when that starts happening, and you start asking questions like, what is the purpose of the state? Because if it's not providing security and assurances and a safety net for myself and my peers and my loved ones, um, uh, frankly, and I don't want to put the E on your podcast, what the fuck are you doing?
right. Yeah. Well, I think that that comes down to a very keen question when, it gets into the question of like the status quo. And I kind of wanted to jump off of this conversation onto the next question because I think it really kind of hits on something we're talking about here. My last question about intelligence and international security, before we shift to more cultural topics, currently hip in geopolitical circles, Peter Zion, um, Zihan, sorry, I always get the dude's name wrong, author of The End of Globalization, is gaining attention for the idea that the war in Ukraine has brought about the end of an era where we could consider globalization to be an active process. With the internet and infinite technological potentials, it seems like there's going to be a breakdown, reshuffling, and reorientation of the international status quo in the coming decades. As a specialist within the wide-ranging field of intelligence, what do you think of the notion of the breakdown of globalization and the impact it will have on you and what so many of your colleagues do to maintain some sort of measure of international order and pardon my quote fingers, peace and prosperity?
I truly don't think I could be more prepared for this question. A lot of academic research into international relations and international order, it's not done, the lion's share of that's not really done out of the United States. It's done out of Canada, who has a very vested interest in international order as a middle power. They
Right.
are very much the we need to abide by the rules. Go figure. They're Canadian. But
Truly wonderful people.
yeah, I loved my time in Vancouver and Montreal and the studying and the time that I spent in Toronto. Great country. Single payer healthcare. Shocker. It's fantastic.
Yeah,
Um,
it works.
um, so I might have obliquely already answered this. So we're gonna, I'll repeat myself a little bit, like an old person will want to do. Um, Talking about Westphalian sovereignty, actually, which, if any of your listeners didn't take obscure European political history, I'll talk through it a bit. The Peace of Westphalia, that's it was a two-for treaty signed in 1648, and it ended the 13 and the 80 Years' War back to back, and it basically codified what an air quotes state is specifically the inviolability of borders and non-interference with domestic affairs, which is hilarious because the minute the treaty was signed, those states just turned around and started sending human intelligence agents into those states to start fucking around. Um,
Right.
and during my time in academia, I wrote what some professors called polemically about the fact that Westphalia is dead.
Mm.
Not in
Yes.
like a Gibsonian cyberpunk, the state is an arm of the corporate enterprise sort of way, but in like, as I said, like neoliberal markets have and information connectivity, we're all connected. So like, what is a border on a map? Uh, though it does have geopolitical import. So what I do think when it comes to international order is that we're going to start seeing, whereas for a long stretch of time we had a bipolar world during the Cold War, which is a hilarious metaphor and double entendre, to a unipolar world. And what I thought for a long time was that we're going to start seeing a multifaceted world, like a world with a couple of transparencies over it of different arenas. And when I'm thinking, I've come around and I realized that I was wrong. What we're going to start seeing is that international order fracture back down. We're rejecting modernity and returning to tradition. Global markets and geopolitical regions are going to start fracturing back into just that. And we can already see that, like right now today, with Russia,
Hmm.
with China, with Saudi Arabia. They're grasping at this. They've kind of realized that rather than compete against the world police that is the United States post 9/11, it's better to have regional hegemony over a part of the world than be a middle power globally. And
Mm.
that adjustment, as regional powers are aspiring to hegemony and global markets reorient alongside of all of those factors, um, alongside the other thing in play that has been hanging Damoclean over this entire conversation, which is climate change.
Yes.
Um, all of those things, right? The fracturing of international order of global markets into more regional based ones with aspiring hegemonies in those areas, information connectivity, narrative conflict, and climate change. All of those things are going to force not just the idea of what what is the purpose of a state? What is peace? What is prosperity?
Mm.
Do we like, is home ownership the dream when like we have people are being priced out of homes? Like, I think the American dream for you and I is going to shift, and within that, to use a forced metaphor, we're tossing and turning right now within the American dream and reorienting that. And that's a lot of words. That's very. I sound like a cliche at a post grad party. So
No, that put it very well. I actually I have two questions that arise out of this, if you'll permit me.
no, please.
Um, so the first one has to do with, I guess the blunt way of asking this is the idea of the middle nation or the BRICS nation. Do you think was that over? Was that dying post 9/11, or do you think the pandemic killed that, or was that an illusion all along?
I think no. Okay, yeah. Solid question. I think that was naivete. Maybe not an illusion, but naivete, because that was an extension of this sort of idea that BRICS nations, um, and specifically Russia and China come into play, not to other them, but I can talk at length a bit more about those two examples. And I think that you did say when we were arranging the interview that you did want to ask a couple of things about China. I think,
Right.
um,
Yes.
but I think a lot of market analysts and academics that were looking at that were, in that sort of, again, Pollyannish 2008 idea. Everybody's operating good faith. Everybody just wants, if the markets are, if line goes up, everyone's happy, and we're not gonna cheat the system. And what we're seeing is no, that is not the case. There are some people, not some people, but organizations and institutions that um, were tolerating what they felt to be in perpetuity in the global order, and now they're seeing opportunities to assert themselves regionally. Let's leave it at that.
Okay, so that leads to the next question that kind of sprung up about that. Thank you for leading me there. You brought up Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is currently in the process of doing huge infrastructure development from the Wall, which is essentially a giant city that they're trying to
Mhm.
build out in the desert, to I think MBS. I think it's Mohammed bin Salman. Um, he is building another city outside of that. At the same time, Russia has tried to expand into the North Sea and the Arctic Ocean for their oil reserves. You brought up climate change, which is a really important point because climate change is obviously going to, in time, not immediately, give Russia access to Siberia and the large amount of resources that are there, but of course, that's decades away still. Um, with these powers trying to go back to a more regional model, because this has actually come up recently with the reporting in Ukraine, since their counteroffensive was, at least by the media's conclusions, very successful. There's this kind of talk that Russia's already been relegated because of their military losses and their economic losses back to a regional power, and it's going to be years before they're quote unquote a global threat to something like an organization like NATO. What's the real probability of success for places like China and Russia and Saudi Arabia, breaking back down to the regional? Because in many ways, the BRICS nations, those being Brazil, Russia, India, China, and I believe South Africa,
Mhm.
um, they all directly benefited from globalization, especially economically, for such a long period. How do they do can they successfully consolidate back down to being regional powers and still remain economically viable? Like, is there a real path for success for these members? Because I have to be honest, when it comes to like India, especially with how the pandemic hit them, and then they had, of course, this kind of black fungus respiratory disease that happened on top of COVID. And then, of course, Brazil has had so many issues with Bolsonaro, and of course, the degradation of the Amazon rainforest.
Mhm.
Um, what chance do they really have? Because for me, just even as an outside observer, not working in an area like the IC, it just seems to me like there's no real path home for them.
So your question is,
Or am I being too much of a humanist and expecting them to care about their people?
well, I mean, in a strictly Hobbesian sense of what a state is going to be looking towards, not even to be Machiavellian about it, like in a Thomas Hobbes the Leviathan sense. No,
Right.
you're sort of um, Stalin-esque, just like the numbers are the numbers. For better or for worse, a lot of states are going to do that. But this question is frankly a postgrad dissertation, and it is one that I would read breathlessly. What we're seeing right now with BRICS nations, and I will truncate that to BRIC. I'm not Mach 3 on South Africa or what they're doing. I do know that they're wielding some influence in the nascent African Union, but they haven't done a ton of stuff as far as conflict resolution with a couple of other intrastate issues that are going on sub-Sahara. But Brazil, India, China, and Russia, we can see in a like analytical sense that they are all trying different paths, like they're taking different avenues towards that sort of regional hegemony. So you've got Russia that basically, and I've said this before in other interviews and on a few other podcasts, Ukraine is Putin's Iraq. Like that is his 2003 Iraq, straight up.
Wow.
Where he is just throwing money and burning capital, and by capital I mean like actual money as well as political capital as well as personal capital at this
Human
problem.
capital. Yeah.
Yeah, he's just throwing it at the problem, and he's not getting anywhere because there is an entrenched local community that does not want that. To the point where local Russian publications, at the time when they launched the invasion, said like an equivalent of "we are going to be seen as liberators," which we've heard, like Americans have heard that before.
Yeah.
That rhymes with history, and a lot of that makes sense with when you take a look. And this, we don't need to go into like a profile on Putin, but it makes sense with who he is relative to where he grew up, how he grew up, his working background, where he is politically, where he is in his lifespan, and frankly, wanting Ukraine and wanting a restoration of the former Warsaw Pact as a buffer zone against NATO, which is that is 90-second briefing on the war in Ukraine right now.
Yeah.
Fun factoid, you've seen me say this in my OSINT IG account, Warsaw Pact states have only ever been invaded by other Warsaw Pact states. Just like to throw that out there.
Oh yeah.
But China, which is, well, let's do India first. Actually, no, correction. We'll do Brazil. Brazil is just taking like the very sort of chauvinistic authoritarian run, and it's not having a good time. There's a lot of factors for that that are both domestic and bearing out of Bolsonaro being authoritarian and I think politically speaking, gross.
That's a nice way of putting it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we can find him politically gross. And then India is taking a really curious way where they did have a lot of issues with COVID, black fungus, and economic development. What I have seen on my end as far as keeping an eye towards them is pivoting in this very curious way where they're warming up to the United States and seeing what China's doing, that being their neighbor, and they're collaborating with great expediency with Australia, with South Korea, with Japan, and basically forming the equivalent of an Asian NATO to pincer move and keep China contained within the region. And that's very exciting and very curious to me because those are all rather large states that would, if that can be codified, rather effectively keep Beijing in place. And that brings us lastly to China and Beijing. And not to be Edward Said Orientalist about things, but I do, it's not speculative to say Beijing is looking at the mistakes that Putin and Russia is making, and they're taking notes. And not only that, they're asserting themselves in a number of different ways with OBOR, the One Belt, One Road initiative, with the Asian Investment Bank, which is basically a counterpart to the World Bank, and through things like digital platforms. And um, there is an article from, I believe, 2017 in Foreign Policy. I cannot recall the author immediately offhand, but it was an article that the headline of which was China is cheating at a rigged game, which kind of captures
Yes,
how China sees itself in the world right now.
I remember.
Um,
I actually remember that article. Yes, it's a very good.
and yeah,
Yes.
it kind of provides an insight as to the machinations, because we can again be orientalist about this and say like, oh, they're beard stroking inscrutable people. No, they just see they are a 5,000-year-old civilization, speaking in generalities, that see themselves as having been shirked and subverted by colonialism and the West, and now they have the ability to assert themselves on the global scale once again, and they'll do that by whatever means they want to have the sort of tanzia, um, which is basically hegemony.
Yes.
Um, I think that's kind of what we're seeing is it's all of the BRIC nations going towards hegemony. And again, this could be confirmation bias on my part, or selection bias, but I think that they're all going towards trying to operationalize that hegemony in different ways and looking at each other to find best practices. Also
Ah.
looking at the mistakes and what decisions the United States is making to inform what they do.
So one last question. I promise, but you brought something up. Um, you know, with China looking at Putin right now, and we've discussed this privately online. What do you think China's objectives are now when it comes to Taiwan? Do you think Taiwan is off the table for them now that they've seen, Russia basically boff it with Ukraine? Because in many ways, China has tried to create the narrative that there is no Taiwanese state and there's no Taiwanese. There's just, these political irritants out there in this island who are part of China, and it's just, any day now that they go in and get them and rejoin them to the greater bloc. But is there a consideration now, especially, and from my reading, it sounds like Xi Jinping is basically isolated by himself now. He has a lot of yes men around him. He doesn't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily have anyone around him that is providing him any sort of contrast or conflict to his perception.
Mm-hmm.
So rephrasing this question, is he looking at the failure that Russia is having in Ukraine and reassessing China's future as it pertains with a potential conflict with Taiwan?
Um,
Because arguably Taiwan is just as armed, just as nationalistic, and just as prepared for a invasion from China as the Ukrainians have been for the last 10 years with Russia.
Man, okay, this is a fantastic question. So, first of all, I can't speak at all. Like I do not know if he's surrounded by yes men, but we do know historically when the regent of a state, when the head of government is surrounded by yes men, or even just looking at Kanye West to get cultural briefly, when you're surrounded by yes men, nothing good comes out of that. Just nothing positive is born out of it. Um, I will say, from my own personal views, as you've seen with things that I've published in the open online, I genuinely think we're going to see hot conflict bore out within the next 2022, 3 to 6 years, due
Mm.
to disagreements and issue over uh, the economic exclusive zone, which is basically the UN law of the sea that says this far out to sea, you control the waters. And calling back to China is cheating at what it sees to be a rigged game. The island hopping and the island development that China is doing in the South China Sea is pushing out their claim and saying, well, now we have this far out. They're developing sand barges that are even further out to extend that claim out to go out in the South China Sea and infringe upon the sovereign territory of the Philippines and Taiwan today. Whenever your listener may listen to this, they can hop on to any sort of OSINT Twitter account for military planes that are published in the open, and they'll be able to see at any given time probably no less than 10 up to 30 or 40 military aircraft from Beijing or from China that are flying into the sovereign airspace of
Mm.
Taiwan, not to include drones, which are much harder to track. Um, I think that that's sort of they're not going to necessarily do something like a hot conflict, just rolling troops in. Obviously, they can't with the water border, but bearing something out where those sort of aerial maneuvers cause an issue, where there's a disagreement over territorial border waters, and then from that justifies a sort of attack. Um, that if I were in that position and I were trying to game out what's a way that is justifiable to the global community for hot conflict, that would be it. And that's also completely in kind with the behavior of Chinese fishermen. That anytime there's a U.S. naval vessel, or not even just the U.S., but like commercial vessels that are going through the area, they will harass those boats because
Mm.
if the boats strike back, it becomes an international incident that that drags the PLN, the People's Liberation Navy, out into the water. Um, that's kind of this is very speculative, and I'm not a China SME. I'm not a China subject matter expert, but that's how I see that playing out.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So Petey, you and I have developed a very good dialogue, and I will say friendship through our common considerations on humanity, technology, and the impact these things have on popular culture. One thing that is constantly brought up in conversation across multiple industries and services, including your own, is the growing issue around TikTok, both in terms of how it is consumed and who actually owns and uses its data. Today, in fact, this is being recorded on 9/16/2022, but it will debut on the last Sunday
Mm.
of every month, as Pondering the Orb always does. Um, Today, in fact, there was further confirmation the Chinese government is in fact harvesting direct data from people's phones, including photos, metadata, location, phone numbers, emails, private credit card data. It was actually a very kind of wide ranging list.
Mhm.
However, there's also concern that this issue is somehow being blown out of proportion, considering what other social media platforms do with their data.
Mhm.
We've addressed China, and we can talk more about China in a moment. But what do you think of TikTok, good and bad, and what do you think the actual future of it is? Um, it seems like it's becoming more and more precarious to have in the American public. But what's your reading of it?
I mhm. I no longer have the app on my phone. I will say that with the cut.
Yeah,
But man, TikTok TikTok to me is a lot of things, but it's two mostly. Um, More so than like any tech that I've lived through so far. Um, TikTok is properly the death of boredom. It's novel stimulus measured in milliseconds served by like a weapons grade algorithm. Um, I generally fall into that sort of technology is intent agnostic. A hammer can build a house or commit assault. I fall into that camp.
right. Me
Um,
too.
but TikTok is not a hammer. It is a data collector. All social platforms are, which includes your Google search engine, which includes Gmail. I would advise any of your listeners to start using DuckDuckGo. It's not perfect, but they don't sell your data on the back end. Um, but let's unpack that. Pursuant to getting your data, you're going to be served, like thrilling, titillating, stimulating content breathlessly for hours on end, or you can alternatively be served malinformation to be radicalized into some corners of the internet you never wanted to go into. Again, I have like I don't have a sign. I should get a sign. Narrative is normative. Um,
Yes.
it's still the early days for the app, and there's still and time moves hyperbolically online. Something like the exposure that there's effectively a keylogger inside the app could fumble it and see it crash, and the kids could move on. Um, my concern, and this is strictly because I don't know what all data was being gathered and for whom, which we can generalize that knowing who owns it and what accesses the Chinese government have to private industries in China. And that begets my other concern, which is um, what's being done with that data. Now, the concern with TikTok is one, that weapons grade algorithm, and two, I think that there is a little bit of again, a Hegelian othering. It's another state. It's the Chinese government that has access to this, and they do have unprecedented access. But it does bear out, and I do remind myself. I have to remind myself of this, which is this is hardly different than the fact that Mark Zuckerberg or the C-suite at Alphabet, the owners of Google, um, Jack Dorsey, who I believe, fortunately wasn't Elon Musk, the ownership of Twitter, they all don't have the exact same data, but they have a comparable amount. And what are they doing with that data as private enterprises that are not accountable to any sort of legal restrictions as to what they do with it or who they're selling it to. The specter then becomes what would a foreign government want with that data as compared to what would the C-suite at Facebook. My concern personally for the average American listener for your podcast, I would be more concerned, frankly, with Facebook, with Meta.
Okay.
The Chinese foreign government, yeah, if they get like a bunch of sweet data about like somebody that's in a significant position that they want to exploit somebody, they can do that. But for your average person, like there's more risk of being radicalized or getting targeted content, and at which point like what Facebook is doing with your data to give you to force engagement on those platforms is more of a concern for me. But the scope of collect by TikTok is still significant and troubling. I say that as an intelligence analyst, the amount of collect that they had from people off of viral app is staggering.
Mm. So, kind of pivoting off this question, because you really highlighted that it's not necessarily the platform, it's the practices of the actual ownership and possibly the government entities behind them. Are we going to get to a point where maybe it's not regulating apps or banning apps like TikTok, but do you think that we're getting closer, or are we still pretty far away from, Congress being as ineffective as it is? I still think at some point, probably in the near and closer future, do you think that there's going to be an actual addressment of how our data is handled?
I would.
Because in Europe, they've taken some pretty strict measures, especially with Facebook and Amazon.
And I will say that those, because corporations are going to be oriented towards profit first, a lot of those the changes and the shifts that Amazon, Facebook are having to make are trickling down in smaller portions to um, how it impacts the user interface for Americans, just because they're going to implement like a whatever the lowest common denominator is, they'll just do that and then implement it globally for the most part. Do I see, man, again, uh, not to be the bearer of bad news, I have no, like the median age for Congress for the Senate right now, I believe, is 74.
Yeah,
Um,
it's
it's
no
a
offense to my
gerontocracy.
listeners. It's old. Yeah, it's the olds. We're ruled by the olds.
Yeah, we are living in a gerontocracy. Um, so there, like, a number of those people don't know how to rotate PDF, and that's not just a joke or a
Yeah,
meme. Like, people have asked them on the street, and a number of them do not know. They need their aides to help them with that. So do I see sort of legislation coming down? No, for that aspect, and also the fact that the U.S. is rather laissez-faire about these things. They just let the markets figure it out. So what's the solution? I'm gonna
right.
be a bearer of bad news, and then I'm gonna give some sort of recourse. I have to. I'm an analyst. Um, Critical literacy. If there's no indication that the state, in some capacity, is going to provide regulation to protect us, it's incumbent upon one another to provide support to educate, inform, and provide best practices to one another. So whether it's me tilting at the windmill online, as you have seen me do quixotically, and being like, "Hey guys, I get it. The memes are great. The memes are brilliant. Mark Zuckerberg is buying another house with the amount of data that we provided him this week."
Yes.
Even just being mindful of that, and being mindful of the fact that in the same way that, like, what is safety at a state level, what is privacy at the individual level if we're just giving all of this stuff away for free?
Such an important question. Yes. Yes. Um okay, so let's pivot a little bit more away. We've talked about China already, kind of on a governmental level and on a social level, but let's talk about them on kind of a pop culture level. On one hand, it's awesome that we are finally getting a fuller Asian influence in popular media, but on the other hand, when it comes to media and products from China, we have to ask questions about complicity when it pertains to their obvious human rights abuses. Specifically, right now, the Uyghur concentration camps that they're manning, which have more than a million people in them. Last confirmation I checked. Um, what do you think of the current nature of our relationship as it pertains to America to China, um, when it comes to the content we're seeing beamed across our screens?
Yeah, and just to double back briefly, I don't check it day to day. It's more like quarterly to quarterly, but a million person estimate for the current internment camps and prisons that Uyghurs are being forced into to do forced labor. A million is about right with what I've heard in the last quarter.
Yeah,
Um,
unfortunately.
yes, using internment camps for a reason. We're gonna call them like we see them.
Yeah.
Um, so I think required statement at the top that, like, there is no ethical consumption under capitalism, but that does not give you a license to be unethical with what you consume or how you consume it. Marx was spot on with the first part. We could have used him saying the second part. I had to add that. But to your question concretely, Beijing is employing every means that it has available to garner influence and the power that it seeks, that sort of Pangea, the hegemony or greater affluence at the global level. Now, previously we talked about the AIB and the OBOR, Asian Investment Bank, One Belt, One Road. So, like, that's influence at the infrastructure and investment and economic level. Um, but likewise, as it pertains to screens, that influence can be wielded by withholding its massive market for entertainment. You know, Top Gun Maverick, which is a fantastic movie, very entertaining, even though Tom Cruise is part of a cult, lives as a god king. Um, there was censorship in the first Top Gun movie. He had, pro Taiwanese defense patches on his jacket. Those were removed. I believe one of the production companies was based out of China. I could be wrong on that, but a considerable amount of movies are. Um, or, it could be creating the platforms like TikTok, where the entertainment that you received is like Dorito chip like engineered to be like addictive. Um, polemics or professional contrarians, especially the ones online, they're going to pound the rostrum about, like, Western movies appeasing Beijing, like the MCU, or like a number of other movies that are coming out. Um, but of course, our entertainment is going to appease them. If the impetus is profiteering, they're going to, we're going to compromise whatever we want to get money. So how I see China asserting itself culturally is, one, obliquely through economics, because at this point our culture is tied inexorably to economics, and two, towards making content that can better serve whatever means that they have. I don't. That's a lot of via negativa, drawing the outline again around what it isn't. I don't
Hmm.
foresee. Beijing has tried this before. Um, we in the early 2000s, there was a wave of J-pop, Japanese pop culture, that sort of pervaded into the West. We're currently in a wave of K-pop, um,
Hmm.
but at the time there was Canto pop, and sort of C-pop that
Right.
was based out of China, and it didn't have it had less success than the failure that was J-pop at the time. And J-pop didn't succeed cultural, or it succeeded culturally, but not economically. I don't foresee them trying to replicate that again. What I see is looking at the economics, the back end, and asserting itself there, because that's if you're signing the check, then it doesn't matter. You can just curate whatever you want, and that's kind of how I foresee a lot of that representation going on, because it's like they've tried for years to have like pro media narratives or newspapers or editorializing, or having someone that's just like an advocate for the state.
Hmm.
The American people are we don't care. What we want to see big gun, like planes make big gun sounds, and if the Taiwanese patches in on the jacket, who cares?
Yeah. If Jet Li kicks another person in the face, we're down for it.
Yeah.
Um, so a much lighter question this time. You're a gigantic fan, as am I, of manga and anime and video games from Japan, but you're also a former resident of South Korea and a deep appreciator of its history, language, and culture. You just highlighted that we did have this J-pop explosion that didn't succeed economically, and then I was actually a big fan of Andy Lau. He's a Hong Kong actor. He was really big in the Cantonese pop scene for a little bit.
Oh, dude.
Um,
Infernal Affairs. Not
yes,
only do I like that
yes.
more than The Departed, and do I say it's a superior movie, he crushes it in that movie.
Oh, Andy Lau is one of my favorite actors. There's a film out there that he did with Jackie Chan about the Shaolin Temple called Warlord.
Hmm.
It's it may not be called Warlord. I think that might be the one with Jet. No, Jet Li's in it too.
Yep.
Um, it's a really fantastic film. But getting to South Korea for a second, South Korea has had such a huge impact on the West in only a decade, and seriously has no signs of slowing. It's interesting because we're talking about China and almost Canton pop or Canton culture. My 2-year-old son Ben, his favorite film right now is Talking Red on Disney Plus, which follows a Cantonese family that immigrated to Toronto.
Hmm.
And the film's very interesting because the main character is this 13-year-old girl who's in, I guess, the equivalent of eighth grade in Canada, and her favorite boy band is this group called Four Town. And one of the characters is actually Korean. He's like a K-pop idol that
Hmm.
came over and joined this like American Western boy band. But I found it very interesting that like there was a movie with Cantonese characters positively depicting a South Korean character.
Hmm.
And I think that in many ways is a reflection of like the I don't use this term in a negative connotation in this sense, but the westernization that a lot of immigrants go through and how that kind of becomes part of the immigrant story here. But you know, it's very clear that here in the West, we have such a deep appreciation for the content South Korea is now putting out, especially on Netflix, where you see so many great South Korea dramas, historical epics, fantasy epics. There's some great South Korean fantasy epics out there.
Hmm.
Um, but what is the draw to this? Why do you think that this is caught on in America so deeply?
Oh man. I love this. Like, I genuinely love this question. I've had my minor for my bachelor's was Korean. Was actually Korean literature. I've talked at length with professors, with friends, about this question, and some of our mutuals are also pretty, like, we are similarly Korea weebs. Korea
Mm-hmm.
boots, I think, is what the medical term. Um, so I know those mutuals will hear this, might disagree with me, but I'm going to drop my personal opinion. Um, I truly believe Seoul saw the successes and failures of that J-pop wave. Um, and I'm specifically saying J-pop because it wasn't like the anime; it was like the musicians. Um,
Yes.
Utada Hikaru comes to mind. I'm trying to think. Namie Amuro was another one that tried to launch Melody of that J-pop wave of the early 2000s, and they took diligent notes. They kind of, in a lot of ways, with the industrial growth that occurred during the 1970s and the 1980s of industrializing South Korea, they saw what drove success. They already knew what drove success in pop culture domestically, and they saw how their contemporaries in China or Hong Kong and Japan tried and failed internationally. But they also, because of the diaspora community that they have in LA, where it's like the largest Korean community outside of Korea, they figured out what's successful in the West and in the United States, by extension Canada, and they've sort of synthesized that into making very very effective pop music that is competently made. It's immaculately made. I've seen people that do not speak a word of Korean find out that I'm fluent in it, and then they will just start repeating entire songs committed to memory. And I'll be like, "Do you know what they're saying?" No, not a word. The melodies
Yeah.
are nice. But that sort of orientation is within Korea. It's about making content that'll be good first. And I will say here,
Mm.
I'm a cultural relativist, so like what is good varies by person to person, country to country, culture to culture. K dramas aren't for me, but they're very popular for a lot of people, which is why they're so successful on Netflix. But after making the best possible content, then they think about, okay, how do we make it most exportable? How do we make it best consumable by other people? And the other thing that I have to say here is, like Japan, the entertainment industry in Korea is something else. It is rigid. It's image control and training that makes Disney kids look like Disney stars, look like latchkey kids in comparison. Like,
Yes.
they are kept in dormitories where they are kept on a sleeping schedule. They're put on diet regimens. They get plastic
Oh, the
surgery.
plastic Yeah, I was about to bring up the plastic surgery regimens have gotten really intense.
It's all of this dance training, classical instrument training, language training at this point, so that any given person, whether they're an actor, a singer, ideally both, any sort of talent, which is calling back to the J-pop days where it was an idol or a talent, not being good at just one thing, um, they can be, they're just this mechanism for creating lowercase a art, music, movies, what have you. Um, so it's just, that is very fascinating, um, because for a lot of people, especially just given how we're raised in the United States, where we explore American history, European history, and then we'll spend like a week on Africa and like maybe like a couple of days on Asia. To employ a metaphor that I've worked on for a long time, within the confines of contemporary Asia, like China would, for lack of a better term, be the USSR of the 80s, in which case Korea would be Germany. It is this cultural force regionally,
Mm.
um, and I'll spare you the details on reunification and the impacts that would have on the region, because it would not be dissimilar to Germany. But it's this powerhouse of culture that sort of drives a lot of other things, and the general direction that Korea has gone, especially recently. Other countries are now looking at that in the same way that other countries in Europe look at Germany and follow that. Like, we're seeing a rise in I can't remember what it's called, but basically like the Thai version of dramas where they're trying to do the same thing because they're
Right.
seeing that success. And you know what? More power to them. I like seeing it.
Yeah. Well, I think that one thing I find interesting about Korea, and you kind of just brought it up, um, reunification has always been a very touchy subject, but when I was going through undergrad, and I have an undergraduate degree in history and religious studies, one thing that we were taught is that China's kind of had this hegemonic hold on the culture of Asia,
Mm-hmm.
that everything was kind of filtered through the idea that China was on top and everyone was kind of like either a vassal state or some sort of tributary to them in history until, they broke off. in the future going forward, is Korea going to take that place as kind of, when we think of especially East Asia, because India and Thailand and Cambodia and all these other places, Myanmar, um, all of these places have their own distinct popular cultures and their own distinct. Um, I'm sorry, I'm kind of losing my words here. But do you think that South Korea and just Korean culture in general will slowly become kind of the defining aspect when we think about Asia in terms of its popular culture, or do you think China maintains a little bit of, I guess, what Westerners see as Asian entertainment?
So I'm gonna
And that and
again,
that may have been a poorly worded question, but
no, it's
um,
there's two ways to go about answering it, and let's hit both, which is regionally and globally, because we're occupying this global market, right? So like
right.
regionally, I don't foresee a sort of Eurovision-esque, we're all getting along and just sort of like everything's hunky dory. What I will see is that like these states are putting out this kind of content, and this is the content that they put out that's extremely good. Kind of like almost like studio houses at this point. Like K dramas are very, very good. There's a reason why, like in the Philippines, Korean dramas are exceptionally popular, more so than, if memory serves, again, not perfect recall, the domestic dramas that are made there. Um, and I think that we're going to get to a place where it's just like some country, it's like, oh no, like Vietnam has like the really good like gangster style rap, which it somewhat spurious, but like a lot of gangster rap or like hip hop that's come out of Vietnam in Cambodia. It's pretty gangster. Um,
Yeah.
so like regionally, that's how I'm going to see things shuffle out, and I think that globally, um, what I hope for. I don't think that I can say that this is what I think will happen, but it's what I hope for is the demystification of Asia, where it's going to go from just like this sort of like again the Edward Said, like the Orient that's inscrutable, and going to become like, no, Korea is bulgogi, it's bibimbap, it's K-pop, it's BTS, it's
Right.
sheet masks, and then like, oh, Taiwan is like pad thai. I can't remember the name for the Thai folk dancing at the moment, and I feel terrible. Like all of these things. So these countries will become more codified globally beyond just like
Mm,
an abstract place that you recall on a map for like geography class and a vassal state to China historically. That is my hope, and I'm inclined to think that the way Western markets work and that sort of drive for novelty that we're seeing with sort of the death of boredom, that's something that can be operationalized quite easily.
excellent. Okay, so I have two questions left for you. Again, thank you so much for your time. Um, Allow me to compliment you. This show,
I
among many
refuse.
things, um, too bad. This show is among many things about synthwave and melodic death metal, both as music and aesthetic. And I think you take some of the most gorgeous shots capturing nature in its liminal piece, as I've come to determine in my head. Sometimes you take shots that look like they could grace the cover of a synthwave album or feature in the scenes of a melodeath video, filled with color and beauty, but also an innate sense of the darkness and shadow. I have to just ask you, and I will email you later for some of your photos so I can include them in the edit of this video. But what draws your eye to nature and this ability that I see for you to find the interstitial, the liminal, and the edges of light through the lens that you use?
Um, Calling back to the conversation we just had about J-pop in China and Korea, there's a term in Korea and Japan. It's mu. In China, it's wu. Um, it's
Mm,
commonly translated as like empty space, but it's space for things to breathe. It's the idea that like in negative space, there's a lot that could be provided there, and it could be fulfilling. It's the opportunity for things. Um, Someone that's very, very special to me once observed that I have a melancholy heart, and it wasn't said complimentary, but I've come to see it as a compliment. Uh, One of like the things that I do whenever I'm walking around and just interfacing with the world is I try and find these still moments. Like I try and find a vista or a scene, and I I see myself as just kind of lurking around like a Bigfoot, finding these places or finding these scenes, and I will wait. Like if I'm in like a lobby or a waiting for the train, I will wait until like a train goes. I will miss it just to okay, I got the shot.
Yeah.
Because those moments have serenity and stillness and peace. And I find personally for me that like finding those moments, documenting them, and like sort of distilling them or distilling that feeling as it varies moment by moment is really important. Like other because when I'm not when I'm not, I'll just speak to myself here, enjoying those or finding those or relishing those, it is a torrent of information. Our phones are just demanding our attention. And finding those brief milliseconds in between where it's quiet, it's peace. It's 4:30 in the morning and I am on a train platform looking at the moon, or I'm on, Mike or hike mile 33, and it's just there's a pleasant vista as it pertains to both you and I, just to explicate a bit more, some of the most touching and profound moments of playing video games as a kid, especially, in like the 16 and the 32 and the 64-bit era, were
Mm-hmm.
like these gorgeous moments inside video games. One of the ones that comes to mind for me is when you're crossing that bridge in Chrono Trigger after you beat like the little skeleton boss, and like it's
Mm.
it's
Yes.
offset by like dark storm clouds, and there's a sun and there's a sea and all this stuff. And it was these moments where like I would just stop playing the game and I would just relish that moment and trying to find that and internalize that beauty and that profundity, if I can be so melodramatic as to say that's what I'm reaching for. Finding that, because I don't know, like yeah, I could fill my IG feed and my posts with just like, oh, it's another night on the town popping bottles. Not that I do pop bottles anymore at my age, but
Right.
that it's how I want to express myself on the platform. I think that there's a lot of with all of the overwhelming information and infographics and everything else that gets posted, providing people, to use a video game term, a save point to just
Yes.
chill.
Well, like the one of the things I appreciate so deeply about your photos, and this is again me complimenting you, so take it for what you will.
Yes, sir.
Um, but one of the things I find so fascinating and so wonderful about your photos is that, again, finding that kind of moo or woo, as you put it, it's finding that sense of beauty in the present.
Yes.
And, I think not only your use of color, but your color really highlights. I guess we are highlighting your use of color, but you provide such contrast and such a vibrancy of depth that it not only feels like with your photos that you're actually there, but you're actually there in the stillness of the moment. I mean, one thing that I like to fancy myself a very, very much a hobbyist photographer in many ways, like what I take on my phone, but you have this ability to capture stillness in a way that, okay, this for everyone at home, pardon me for this analogy, but this is for me the highest compliment I can give someone who works with such wonderful imagery like PD does. Um, One of the most profound moments of my life was my first LSD experience. And one of the things that the LSD experience gives the person who's properly attenuated to the moment, and that's a really action-packed term that would require an entire different podcast to get into. Um, but there's this moment that I call kind of the HD moment where your brain is processing at such a fast rate, and this is a kind of further aside, so pardon me. I tell people, like, people have this weird idea of what LSD is and what it does, but the way I describe it to people, let's say your brain is a computer. You're putting in a hyper futuristic processor that your regular brain doesn't have the capacity to really handle, but fuck it, you put this thing on your tongue. So we're going to
Mhm.
have to handle it.
Yeah.
Um there comes a point where you perceive reality in such high definition in terms of color and clarity and its crispness. And for me, one of the highest compliments I can give your photos is that at the most wonderful heights of an LSD trip, you capture photos that capture the vibrancy and beauty of the world. Because that is, I think, in many ways, the real. And everyone has a different idea of what the goal of art is and what the definition of art is and what we're doing with creativity. But I think finding that moment, that clarity, and that crispness, it's very hard to capture in a photo. And I must compliment you. I think you do it with a very high degree of efficiency and expertise, and that's all I wanted to highlight. So thank you for those photos, and I hope nothing I've said has been too embarrassing.
No, it. First of all, thank you, and I do appreciate that. And I will say, to get to the what you described, when I'm again like lurking around Bigfoot, like, and I'm just taking in the moment and just setting my own pace, and just so I can explore the world
Right.
and try and find these moments and just enjoy it. It's a better way to live because I'm not rushing through things. Is finding a way to capture those scenes or those moments or those tableaus not as they are, but as you want to remember them.
Yes.
Because you're like we've all been on vacation. We've all
Hmm.
taken a photo and been like, this is where I went, but that's not how it felt. And trying to capture it in a way where, no, this is how it's going to feel, requires creating literal metaphors from the visual to the emotional. And doing that because, like, the reality of sitting on a train platform and it's 4 o'clock in the morning and the bench is covered in dew and it's a little muggy, and there's a couple of bugs out. Like, that's the reality of it. The emotionality of it is it's synthwave, right?
Hmm.
It is
Yes.
the drive soundtrack. You feel like a real cool guy. And in capturing that moment with like the black, like the absolute darkness of the dark, the brightness of the street lamps, and the placement of the moon in the sky. Like, that's how we feel. That's how we recall it. And creating that moment for people, while embracing the fact that it's ephemeral. A lot of those pictures, as you've seen, get posted on stories. They don't get posted on main for archival. I'm trying to be better about that. But I like that. I like that ephemera of just like you get it for about 24 hours and then the moment's gone. Um,
Right.
but I do have them saved, obviously, and Daddy Zuckerberg never forgets. So I will dig up a cohort of them and kick them your way for the edit.
Oh, please do, because I would really like to show them off. You brought something important by synthwave is in part about kind of like creating that aesthetic and that image and that kind of self projection. When you hear this, you want to drive fast, or you want to drive slow on the Pacific Coast Highway, or you want to hike through a mountain. You want to do something, but you want that novelty. And I think one thing that you hit on earlier in the conversation, really good photos are able to capture the novelty of the moment and make them last forever. I
Mm-hmm.
think the beauty of what you do in capturing, like I said, that kind of liminal piece is that it takes real talent to capture that moment and have it be something that you can look at again and again and be like, I'm in that moment. And I think, again, another compliment. I think you really nail that. So I would really like to show the world the photos during of course, the edit of this podcast. And please keep taking these photos. They're truly fantastic.
Sir, that is my therapy. That's how I cope with everything that I do for a living. Is just lurking around the city or in nature and just being like, no, this is a moment. But yeah, it's on the back end. I'll kick a bunch to you via email. It's man, we could talk about I could talk about future funk and synthwave and how that is a deliberate sonic movement that's capturing the promise. It's capturing the mood of what the past thought the future was going to be. It's a nostalgic promise.
Yes, and I think, especially with what I try to highlight on Pondering the Orb, um, I think there's a lot of composers within synthwave that are finally getting to the point where they're pushing the medium forward.
Mm-hmm.
Not just the genre of music, but like actually pushing the aesthetic forward and pushing it into places where it's outside of the 80s and 90s to a certain extent. And the 80s the 80s really do feature kind of that retro wave, vaporwave aesthetic, but the 90s had kind of like this dark synth, very much grunge aesthetic that kind of got cobbled onto it. I think the beauty of what synthwave is becoming now is that it's modern, it's simplistic, but it also has this sense of, and you use the word very well, ephemeral, that you can actually hold in your head as you listen to it, or you can hold it as you look at the cover. There's something special about synthwave, and I think you hit on it very well. Like, it's nostalgia, but it's also nostalgia that's trying to move forward with something. So, thank you, very good. One last question, and again, thank you so much for joining me, PD.
Ah, my pleasure.
You're you're not only you not only provide thoughtful analysis through your OSNet channel, but I also feel you have a deep sense of hope in people's ability to advocate and advance themselves in what I perceive to be a deeply humanistic way, so I value it very much. At the same time, you work in a profession that has to deal with some difficult truths most do not appreciate, and metrics others often don't afford in their thinking about the world. For my final question, what gives you hope in what seems to be very bleak times for our fellow human beings?
Ooh. Um, the first thing that comes to mind, like that is a large question, obviously, but one of the first things that comes to mind for me is I don't want to say this. Trying to find the words because this question kind of hit. I'm lacking any substantive response, and I do apologize. Um, Hope is it can't be eradicated, frankly. The joke that I make, the cliche that I've invoked with you and our peer group is, I stare into that gyre so that you don't have to.
Mm.
But as from my own lived experience and a lot of my peers or a lot of my coworkers, the gyre stares back, like you eventually become the monster. And rather than going through that whole process, reminding myself is from a lesson hard learned in therapy is that pain demands to be felt. Like if I walk away from something and I'm feeling pretty depressed or cynical, I express that, I talk through it, I think my way through it. But really, it comes down to the fact that like narratives, even when you're reporting on things that are happening in the real world, it's still a narrative. It's still a sequence of events that are occurring, are malleable and can be changed, and you have autonomy. Um, Internalizing this sort of idea of reject dystopia. Um, and part of that involves like finding power within yourself to operationalize change and support others at whatever level you can. And even if that's you had a terrible day at work, you're listening to this podcast and you get home, you're gonna have to cook dinner. Um, your partner or your kid or somebody comes home and they had a bad day, just being there for them to talk through it, not to editorialize or tell them what they need to do, but just like, no, like, let's talk through this. I want you to express what's going on with you. I want to hear it, and then being able to support them. And that's exhausting and it's not easy, but you'll find that, like, in the very big picture way, like, the more I've made myself available for people when they're overwhelmed or scared and supported them or just listened to them when they had to event something, as you know, as you've seen firsthand in our social circles, it's made me stronger. Like, I found that, like, I'm not drained from that stuff, and trying to impress upon people is not easy, because everything on the internet and everything in our meat brain says, our meat computer says, no, dude, you need to be selfish. It's like, no, you really and truly don't. None of us will be able to, as individuals, be able to affect the change that we want to see in the world, to reject dystopia. So it's going to take all of us. And to do that, that requires full call back to supporting unions, solidarity.
Yes. Absolutely. And, you know, I thank you for that perspective, and I agree with it fully. Petey, thank you so much for coming on and talking about a diverse array of topics, especially international security and intelligence. Can you let people know where they can find you, especially with your OSNet channel?
Yes. So you can find me, most of the content, and by most I mean all of it, at this point gets pushed out to Instagram.com/the OSINT report. Spelled like it sounds, TheOSINT report. Unless we become particularly cool, don't try and follow me on my personal account. You'll see the pictures, and I appreciate it, but, like, that's for me and my loved ones and the people that I'm close friends with. But you can find all of the content. My DMs on that account are always open, so truly anyone is welcome to reach out to me and say, hey, what's this headline mean? Hey, this is something that worries me. Can you push it or let people know about it? And as Jay has seen time and again, I will turn around and be like, this is how you avoid having your phone's IMEI copied if you're going out to protest, or this is what you need to know about ongoing threats that are being reported if you're going out to vote and people are going to try and pressure you. Like, information wants to be free. So if you need something that is explained or for other people to know, I am happy to be an avenue for that.
Thank you for joining me for another episode of Pondering the Orb. As always, please subscribe to the channel and check out the links to the authors, music artists, and guests that appear. And as always, I wish you nothing but safe journeys. See you next time.